I'll open the meeting of the Expenditure Plan Advisory Committee. I'm David Early. The first item on our agenda is to take public comment on any items which are not on our agenda otherwise. Is there anyone who would like to address the EPAC on an issue not on our agenda? Okay, seeing none. We have the minutes from September 28th. Is there anyone who has any comments or edits to those minutes? I would note that we did include within them both the report by Robert Liberty as well as a copy of the memo from Save Mount Diablo, which were both discussed at last month's meeting as part of the minutes. Are there any other comments, questions? Can I have a motion to approve the minutes? By Ron Brown, second. By Rita. All in favor? Any opposition? Any abstention? One abstention from Patricia. Two from Jack. Two abstentions from Patricia and Jack, and otherwise it's passed unanimously. All right. Under item D, general business, we have two items. One is the meeting calendar, which is in your packet on page D.1-1. Our next meeting after today is scheduled for October 26th. And that was intended to be a meeting at which we would finish up both an expenditure plan and any policy revisions that we want to submit to the authority board. It's my opinion that we may be a little behind on that schedule, and we do need to fulfill that by the early part of November. So staff and I have talked, and we want to suggest both the meeting on October 26th, but an additional meeting 2 weeks after that, which would be Monday, November 9th. That we would add to our calendar with the goal of being able to finish this package after 3 more meetings, today's meeting, the 26th, and then November 9th. Can most of you who are here, that is a time and would be here 1 o'clock on a Monday, consistent with all our other meetings. Can that work for most people? I don't see you all jumping up and down with joy about another meeting. But is there anybody who would object to scheduling an additional meeting that way? Certainly if we get done by, if this is if necessary. If we're done by the end of the next meeting on October 26th, we'll not need that meeting. But I think it would be good to get it on our calendars now. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do that for November 9th. And then we do have a meeting Monday, December 7th, because by that time the authority board will have acted, we think, and there may be a need for your comment at that time. I'm not 100% sure if that meeting will be needed, but we'll look at that as the authority board itself continues their work. The other item in your packet under item D is the action item log. There's a large number of action items at this point. We're not going to try and go through those in detail, but I did want to ask if there were any questions about the action item log. Okay, hearing none, we will go on to the bulk of the agenda, and that's item 1.0 is our first item on policy development. You all will recall that last time we met, we had on our agenda both the expenditure plan itself as well as policy items, and we did not get to the policy discussion. So today we decided to agendize it in the opposite order, so we'll do the policy discussion first and take the time we need on that. We did send out, outside of the packet, in an email that came out on Friday, a cover email with a set of potential policy concepts. And this is a list of policy concepts that really is, it's not something coming from staff and consultants. It's a list of what we understand you all to have suggested, various individuals have suggested as possible policy concepts that you would like to see included in the measure. We've put them together really as just a starting point for your discussion. And Eric Zell wants to say a few words about them, and then we're hoping to dive into a discussion that all of you can respond to these ideas and add any other ideas you might have, with the goal today that we really do get to a point where we have a good sense of which policy items, if any, meet the broad support of members of the EPAC and should be included in a package moving forward to the authority board. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric for a few comments.
Can I just get a clarification that this is, what's the Yes, but it's also this document. Yeah, it's only this document. It says EPAC Transportation Expenditure Plan Summary of Policy Concepts, and it was out at the front. It was not in the online packet. It was mailed to you, I understand.
It was emailed separately.
Or emailed to you.
And it's at the front if you don't have it.
Does everybody have that document? If not, we'll make sure you get it. Okay. So again, I'm Eric Zell. I'm a member of the consulting team, and I've been working on these measures since 1986 and have worked on trying to and have successfully developed agreement on plans that ended up in the Measure C, Measure 1988, and the 2004 Measure J. And so we're at a critical point in this process with all of you relative to what this plan is going to look like going forward, and it has to meet a number of tests. It has to obviously meet the test of getting what many of you would like to see in this measure. It has to be able to get the support of a majority, if not all, of the cities in this county who ultimately have to place it on the ballot. It has to get the support of the County Board of Supervisors who has to place it on the ballot. And it ultimately, at the end of the day, has to get the support of the voters. So we have this enormous balancing act, if you will, of trying to put together a measure that's going to meet all of those criteria. And so we are hoping that the focus today, while you receive both the policy items and the stocking, if you will, the straw man expenditure plan, we want you to spend as much time focusing on these policy issues as you feel is necessary so that we can really get the kind of direction we're going to need and make sure that all of your voices are heard around these issues. Because these are issues that you have brought to us. Some people may agree with them, some people may not. The voters may or may not agree with them. But the bottom line is these are issues you have all brought to the table, and we need to figure it out, if you will, as a group, so that we can make sure that we can move this process forward as best as possible. So those are the comments I wanted to make. David, I don't know how you want to start the discussion.
I did want to mention that Sarah from EMC Research, who does the polling, is here. We're not going to have her speak right now, but if there are questions about how any of these policy issues might play with the voters, Sarah can respond to those from her knowledge of the polling as well. And I want to propose, I see Mike already ready to talk, which is great, but I wanted just to suggest that maybe we start with a very open-ended discussion, but based on this document that we've given you. Again, these are not meant to be a list of proposals. These are a list of ideas, and we want you to go through and tell us broadly, are these acceptable? Do you like them? Do you not like them? As we move this forward, in half an hour, as we've gone along, perhaps we'll want to look at these individually, either by topic or by sub-bullet, and vote thumbs up, thumbs down on them, or maybe not. It may be that the discussion evolves in such a way that we want to go in a different direction. But I think we should begin with a broad discussion of just what do you think of this document and the ideas that are in it. Mike, do you want to start?
Well, actually, my question was about Eric's introduction and your reference to polling. I'm just curious. So you've done some preliminary polling on projects and expenditure categories. Am I correct that there's not been polling about either the existing growth management plan or additional policies that might be included in the expenditure plan? And then secondarily, if the group comes out with a set of recommendations, would you envision polling those along with expenditures?
Yes. So there hasn't been in-depth polling on any of these specific concepts. Obviously, the growth management component is an element of the existing plan, as always talked about in that context. But these specific ideas have not been polled. Ultimately, at the end of the day, whatever draft expenditure plan and policies go forward, both from this committee and from the authority, there will be additional polling to basically understand, is it going to be successful? You know, part of this is a little, not off subject, but part of the issue here is, will certain issues, positively or negatively, influence the outcome of an election around this issue? If a particular issue is opposed to by a particular interest who is going to do everything they can to defeat the measure, then that's an issue. And that will vary from issue to issue and along the line. So we're very conscious of those issues.
I might suggest, though, that Sarah could talk a little bit more about this, because although Eric's absolutely right that these specific questions haven't been polled, there has been both polling and focus groups, as I understand at least, that have at least peripherally addressed questions about housing provision and growth management as they relate to transportation. I think Sarah can speak to those. Is that correct?
May I interrupt real quickly before we get to this? Would you suggest then that in this discussion we should try to apply our own analysis of what is politically acceptable and would create more voter receptivity, or would you prefer that we leave that aside and speak purely from the perspective of what our organizations and we think are important policies to be in the expenditure plan?
I think it's really up to you, but I don't think we can ignore. The reality is we can't ignore those factors as we go through this process. We could possibly ignore it with right here, but we're not going to ultimately be able to ignore it with the voters.
Are people okay if Sarah gives us 3 to 5 minutes on what she knows about these issues?
Probably not even that long.
Okay, great.
Hi, everybody. Sarah Labatt, EMC Research. Nice to see you all. So as Eric and David mentioned, we have done some polling for CCTA in general. We did some focus groups as well. We haven't tested explicitly some of these concepts that are before you today. They've come up in various contexts in focus groups and in some of the surveys. So, we know from our polling in this county, both for CCTA and others, that transportation improvements are important. We also know from doing some focus group research and talking about a transportation improvement plan, an expenditure plan, and a measure, and then we start talking about some of these things like growth management or other issues that on their surface to the average voter might not sound like a transportation-related element, that it's hard for voters to connect those things. So from the voter perspective, I would say you definitely want to sort of be aware of how ultimately this has to be passed by 2/3 of the voters in this county. So, and what they want to hear about is a measure to improve transportation in the area and all the things that come with that, including road surfacing and potholes, including traffic smoothing on roads and highways, including BART and transit and buses and walking and sidewalks and all these things that we all know are important and the voters believe are important too. So I think, with respect to how the voters look at all of this, and you have a few slides in your packet provided at request from a poll we did last year asking about sort of all of the line-by-line expenditure plan elements. There's like 3 slides in your packet of the poll data from last year. And, the summary is, everything's important. They want it all, which is why you're all here to try to help figure out sort of how to balance all of that with what you all are looking for and what the county might need. So coming back to the original question, we haven't asked explicitly about all these concepts that are on this page that you're looking at now. There's certainly some places where, people do find managing the effects of growth important in the general. I think the challenge is making sure that in the conversation that's in the public that it's connected with how is this going to help transportation in the county.
Thank you. Are there questions for Sarah? Kristen?
Oh, no, I didn't have any questions for Sarah. So if there are
Does anybody have a question for Sarah? Okay, thank you. Kristen.
Sure, thank you. Just wanted to make a clarifying comment as I'm interpreting Eric's introductions and this. I am looking at this list of the summary of policy concepts as a manifestation of the visioning exercise, right? We're attempting to see the way that vision may be implemented in specific ways, because I think that there is a high likelihood it's much easier. It would be much easier for us to fail than for us to succeed as a committee, right? That is my sense from listening and talking to folks, and there is a shared commitment, but I think we need to flush that out to a greater degree. So I think that we should be thoughtful about, looking at this. And to Mike's question before, I think that the point is, can our particular constituencies live with the components of this, or can we not? And that is a discussion that we need to start having in a meaningful way here, or we will be even less destined to succeed here, and I want us to succeed. So I think that this is, if we think about that, and I might be interpreting this wrong, so if I've got this wrong, let me know, but I think that this is an attempt to get a little bit more specific, a little bit more detail about how we might achieve the vision, goals, and objectives that we spent so much time thinking about and talking about at previous meetings. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking of it. And I think on the other hand, I think you could say we don't need any of these policies to implement that vision we came up with. We can implement that vision only through expenditures. But there are a number of committee members who've said, in addition to expenditures, I think we need to make some policy changes also. And so I think you're right that these policy changes or concepts would be hopefully consistent with the vision you all have put forward. But I certainly wouldn't argue there that and we're not expecting that you'll do this entire list in order to implement that vision. But hopefully everything on this list is consistent with that vision. And the question is, do you want this particular package, or do you want a lesser package or a different package?
So then just as a follow-up, what process do you as our facilitator recommend that we go through to have a meaningful discussion about what people think?
Well, like as a moment ago, what I recommended is that we begin by a generalized discussion, that you all say, I read this and I thought it looked great. It looked like it wasn't enough. It looked like too much. It looked too restrictive. It looked too whatever. And maybe then we go into some specificity. Maybe people say which parts they did or didn't like. And as we're hearing that, I think it'll become clear whether it's useful to go through these line by line or if it's useful to address them in some other way. But I'd like to begin with as much time as is appropriate just to hear from all of you. As you read this 2 pages, 1.5 pages, what were your overall thoughts in terms of whether there's something you would like to see as part of this overall package that we're sending on to the board? So I'm starting to see some hands, which is great. So I've seen Andy, Debbie, Tim. Oh, wow. Okay, Ron and Dave. Andy first.
So are we talking about the EPAC vision, goals, and objectives, or the Transportation Expenditure Plan summary of policy concepts?
The second one.
The summary of policy concepts?
Yes, the vision was already adopted.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Just wanted to clarify, because I do have at least one comment on this in just reading it for the initial time. The second point, vehicle miles traveled, and I don't know how picky you want to get at this discussion point, or if you want to keep everything at the 20,000-foot level. I think it's going to be very difficult to adhere to this policy, limit TEP investments to those that will lessen VMT and or support non-single occupant vehicle modes of travel. While there's definitely in the strawman TEP proposal some great options for non-single occupant vehicles that I think should be explored, because I think that's probably much of the future of transportation. There are many things, and the polling bears this out, that the voters are going to want to see that support single occupant vehicles, such as interchange improvements, lane widening, even the dollars that they have for integrated corridor mobility, advanced traffic management, which utilizes the latest in technology, is something that's probably going to support single occupant vehicle mode of travel. So I think it's going to be very difficult to enforce that second point, and I think that's a good goal for the future. I just don't think it's realistic in this expenditure plan.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Debbie?
I would sort of second that. I apologize for being tardy, and I apologize in advance for leaving early. That's why Ty is here today. But I wanted to come before going to Sacramento to talk about some policy issues. But this just is a glaring, like, there's nothing about senior and disabled transportation on our policy concepts here, and I think that's to me, a glaring omission. I think that when we passed Measure J, we were looking at a paratransit study that was done in 2002 that made specific recommendations that haven't happened yet, and the need is still there. So I think that in order to be responsible, we really should address what the need is for the senior and people with disabilities populations. I brought some information which I will pass out, but I have both policy and TEP development input that I've written down on a paper, and I can pass out to the group.
I'm going to ask Andy, what's your name? Eric.
My name's George. So Debbie, in response to that, this is intended to be, if you will, just policy statements about every potential funding source. So seniors and disabled issues will get addressed through funding, correct? And so there's dollars in there. And this isn't to direct funding. I just want to be clear so that we just don't get into the discussion of every issue out there. It's how do some of these issues as a policy going to relate to the funding? So as an example, you could say that there's a pot of money that provides an incentive for cities to do certain things. It could be where they make their transportation investments. You could say we're going to, incentivize transportation investments to support infill development or so on and so forth. So the question, I think, for you is how do you see that as it relates to the dollars that will already be in there for seniors and disabled? In other words, is there something else other than the expenditure dollars that you would want to be included?
Yes. So specifically, looking back to what the Board of Supervisors approved at their last meeting in relation to staff recommendations, that there be a mobility management component to all dollars that are spent on senior and disabled transportation. That is a policy perspective, and I have listed on the paper that I'm happy to pass out the sort of policy perspective things that the Board of Supervisors looked at. But I would say most importantly is having the mobility management component be at the center of the funding that goes to any kind of transit, whether it be my agency or fixed route agency or whatever, that we're doing it smarter, because if you look at mobility management, and I'll pass this out too, our costs in Contra Costa County for senior and disabled transportation are going like this. Where mobility management happens, the cost per trip are going like that. And so there is a policy piece to it, and I'm happy to pass that out.
No, I think that's very helpful, and that's exactly what we're looking for.
The next speaker was going to be Tim.
Actually, my comment is going to be similar to what Debbie said and what Eric responded. So I think the question was really for me, as I looked at all these policy concepts, whether or not a policy would have been important to list down here in terms of focusing on really a majority of the customers that are using public transportation, which are low income. I don't know how you put that into a policy statement of such, but I can live with what Eric said, and we can deal with it later.
Okay. So I have Ron and then Dave, and I don't know if Patricia and Margaret and Lisa.
Yeah, Ron Brown from Save Mount Diablo. I've looked over this list, and as we've just heard, there are things that some people have looked at the list and say, my stuff isn't there, or the things I'm concerned about isn't there. And I think this is a good beginning for us to kind of begin collecting. But then the question is, once we get a comprehensive list, what do we do with it? And so that's the piece I want to address for a second. We created a vision statement to begin with, and I'm wondering if there's a piece that's missing between that and this list and figuring out what we do with it. We're kind of at an interesting moment in time with an opportunity to create some new funding to address some things that we've said we would like to be transformational. And transformational things are happening all around us in the world today in terms of how things are funded and technologies and any number of things. And here's really an opportunity for us to take this moment and create a transformational funding plan to help us move into the next, century way of living. But we need some enabling policies that are going to help us figure out what we do with those things. Eric, your comment about figuring out what we want to do and creating some incentives, I think is a right way to do it, and see if we can encourage things through the incentives to do activities, projects, and programs that are indeed transformational. And I think our ability to do that is linked to having some performance standards that are a required component of this, and I don't know that we've really talked about that. And in fact, we've heard that from the past measure, there hasn't been the ability to report on the outcome of some of the programs. And so I think that's a critical piece. What are we trying to accomplish? How do we quantify what we're trying to accomplish at the beginning through some performance standards and some ongoing oversight that we can lend to the program that lends itself to monitoring and evaluating how well we're doing in meeting those standards, and the potential for stopping or reallocating funding if we're not meeting our objectives along the way. And then the final issue is enforcement. What's our ability to actually enforce agencies and jurisdictions to comply with the performance standards that this measure is attempting to address? So that's a piece that's not maybe easily defined, but I think it's the missing step between the vision we have and this list that we're now looking at.
Dave.
Comment and a request. The comment is the vision statement list of bullets that are on the back of the two-pager, which I thought captured our comments from the last meeting pretty well. Number 5 talks about, or captures this concept of providing commuters with choices. What can we do to give commuters choices? And I don't think it's captured really well in this EPAC summary of policy concepts. I think it's lost in there, so I'd like to see it in there somewhere. And then my request is going to be for Sarah Labatt to come back up to the microphone, if that's okay. Can Sarah give us a sense of, if we were going to maximize voter support for projects that help people who drive, who want to drive, I want to drive, whether alone or with others, I want to drive, projects that help me, versus projects that help give people choices to either drive sometimes, walk sometimes, BART sometimes, etc. If we could maximize the right balance from what we're hearing from the voters, what would be your advice to this committee?
It's a good question. I think we have to be careful that, the voters aren't going to come up with a transportation plan, right? We can't ask them to do this thing that you all are doing and every part of the county is doing, the CCTA is doing. So I think, all we can do really is put something in front of them and have them react to it. And I think my answer would be, it has to be something that's balanced. It has to have some things in there for people that are going to be steadfast about driving. It has to have some things in there that for people that would like to see bigger thinking about how to make it, give choices, make it easier, make it a better choice to be able to get out of the car or have another option for traveling. And it has to have options for people that are never going to get in a car and all the various other ways they're going to get around. So maybe I'm not understanding your question, but I feel like the answer is it can't be about one thing.
No, let me focus you in a little bit more. What is your advice for us getting it right? What is the right balance? Is it 50-50, 60-40? We're obviously going to have some of both, I agree. What's the right balance?
If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't have to, nobody would have to do anything. I don't know the answer. I think the balance has to be a little bit of everybody's interest in this room and a little bit from all the cities and from the county that responds to what, good engineering says is needed, to what people know looking forward, what their populations are going to be interested in. And I think part of it really is about spreading the message that this is needed. So a piece of the balance, I believe, is about the execution of or how you come to the plan, if that makes sense. So, it's not, no one can write one plan that's going to be the right thing that the voters are all going to love, because part of what they're going to love is the amount of process and thinking, thought, conversation that goes into creating a plan. So, there's not really an answer to like the percentage balance for everything that goes into it. It's more having a process that shows that everybody's needs were heard, that, we're making an attempt to address needs the best we can. We're always going to be in a limited funding environment. So, yeah, the perfect answer is all the money you want for everything. We don't have it. So, I think part of the answer is process. Really finding a way to show that you've all done your due diligence and made your voices heard and been willing to put your input in and take out a plan that you all can live with. You guys have anything to add? Feel free.
I'm ready to go on. Are you okay, Dave? Okay, so the next speaker is Patricia.
Pat Pyrus from the Sierra Club. I have a couple of questions for clarification, and then a couple of comments. But I think that there's a lot of wordsmithing that could occur in this document, which I don't think we have time for here. And so, how do we deal with that? But specifically, what does the word investments mean? Is it capital projects? Is it programs and projects? Is it any possible use of funds from the measure?
Yes, it's all the money that's going to be generated by the measure. So on the straw man alternative that we've given you, there we have distinguished between projects and programs, but TEP investments would be any of those line items that are the dollars being generated by the sales tax measure.
Given that, then, I think a couple of the suggested policies that require all investments, for example, to follow complete streets requirements, to require participation in ramp. There's a few others that maybe really aren't appropriate for programs, and especially transit operations. So that's one big place where I think some phraseology needs fixing. The housing category seems to me that it has a lot of good opportunities, but also can be used to create some either contradictory or exclusionary housing programs or projects. And I think each of those items need to be looked at as part of a whole. And I guess the last major one I would caution is the second bullet under enforcement, the Independent Taxpayer Oversight Committee, and thank you for not calling it a citizens committee, that reports to the CTA board. There's an issue going on in the Alameda County Watchdog Committee relating to that TEP specified that the Watchdog Committee reports to the public. And there is some real tension in how that might or will be implemented. And I think the public needs to have some accountable group that is reporting to them. So I think that needs to be perhaps discussed a bit more thoroughly.
Thank you for those comments. Next is Margaret, Lisa, and then Mike.
Thank you. The Labor Council met with stakeholder transportation unions and the building trades, and we had a very good meeting where it was brought up that at the 4:30 in the morning, the construction workers getting up in Oakley and Disco Bay there's not a lot of public transit options there. However, there was, an acknowledgement that there needs to be, and there needs to be on weekends as well when people do need the choices we heard about. The other thing that came up, and I think it speaks to what Ron Brown said about this is a chance to do something transformational and different. And in our exercise, which was the two-page draft, bullet point 11, talking about permanent and quality jobs, I think that can show up in this second single-page document to help address the bullet point 2 in a couple of different ways. One is we supporting the infrastructure that is our public transportation system, making sure that there's not a lot of subsidies to privatization or technology that leads to privatization. And we're already seeing that a lot of that creep in. There was a Made in America, Made in California ask of the Teamsters, where in Hayward, the Gillig Bus Factory would love to build a lot more public transportation vehicles. And Pat referred to the ongoing Alameda evolution of that measure, and also I would like to say that in one of the discussions that they're having there now, the Transportation Authority as well as the stakeholder groups that were basically there, EPAC, is a quality jobs matrix and standardization tool. when we say quality jobs, that public transportation and transportation measures should reward and incentivize the quality jobs, they're actually putting definitions to that, what that looks like, and I'd like to see that language in here sooner too, and we will be responding with some of our ideas for that too well before the next meeting.
Lisa.
I'll just go down through this list as quickly as possible in the interest of time. On the first bullet of greenhouse gas emissions, the overall plan is required to achieve greenhouse gas emissions, correct, under the state numbers and the Air Board numbers. Is that correct?
I would be hard-pressed to say what is a requirement under GHG law today,
yes,
but I think there are certain people who would certainly believe that.
So
it would be hard to get this through an environmental review without it showing.
Correct. That was my assumption. And so, if you limit my reading of this proposed policy is that each individual investment would also be required to reduce. And I think our membership would probably oppose that. There are trade-offs within any plan. Some projects may need to have, flat or other, and to subject that requirement to every single project may be counterproductive to the overall achievement of GHG reductions. On VMT reduction, we're interested only really in talking about a VMT reduction per capita. We're going to have population increase in the county. Even the statewide transportation plan, even with very aggressive transit options, couldn't really get that number, the actual overall VMT reduction numbers down. And I wanted to bring this up as well, and I didn't bring enough for everyone, but I can send out an email. There was a study done last year of 21 different communities where transportation sales taxes were approved with a lot of transit in them back in 2001 and 2003. And the researchers went back and looked to see, one, whether or not the percent of people who used transit to commute changed in the time and the 10 years later after those investments were made. And the percentage had remained exactly the same, 5%. So what the researchers concluded from this is that voters support transportation measures that have transit in them, but that support is not a proxy for transit investment, because people envision that a lot of people will support transit as an overall social benefit while personally having no intention of actually riding transit. So I say that with respect to the VMT reduction in terms of having a per capita instead of trying to have an overall, because our goal may be to reduce the solo vehicle travel, but we're going to need to do it in a much smarter way than expecting a plan itself to produce that increased transit share, because that's simply not happened in some of these other places. I'd like to propose, moving on to the infill and TOD, that we combine two policies and change them up a little bit. The first bullet under infill, and then the first bullet under the housing provision. We'd like to see perhaps a tiered structure where incentives are created for communities that, one, build housing of all kinds within their boundaries, within their urban limit lines, and perhaps increased incentives for those who build TOD and affordable housing and some of the other more desired outcomes of housing. But we absolutely have to reverse this discussion about putting controls on housing and finding ways to encourage housing. I'll also send this out to everyone. I just finished this up the other day, and looking at Plan Bay Area, it had a projection for jobs, a projection for housing out through the last iteration, and 4.5 years into that planning period, Contra Costa County is 51% behind on housing. We're 841% ahead on jobs. We've got lots of jobs here. We don't have anywhere for these people to live, so they're all having to commute in, creating further traffic congestion. So I would argue that building this housing, inside the urban limit line in our communities is going to help produce the goals that we want, and we simply have to stop talking about ways to further control growth. And in that sense, we're generally opposed, unless we can be persuaded otherwise, that most of the items under growth management are not policies that we would support, because we just don't see how that possibly works. Clearly, the urban growth controls that we have in the county are working. They're working really well because we don't have enough housing here. Moving down the list, on requiring the TEP investments to follow complete streets requirements, some of the cities that I've talked with say a lot of them already do it, some of them don't do it. I would need more information about what exactly that would mean in terms of a financial impact and whether or not that even has any reason to be there. Requiring participation in RAMP as part of TEP projects. I don't think we're there yet in the analysis of RAMP to determine its benefits. So I'd like to see more discussion about that, perhaps even CCTA having just a policy that they look at a RAMP type of a program for their mitigation rather than putting it in the measure. An independent taxpayer board, in my experience in my past life as a reporter, most of those groups just spent a lot of time and taxpayer money going through those, and some of them didn't have a lot of results. So there would have to be a pretty good structure to suggest that there was going to be something useful come out of it, accountable, and perhaps it may even be necessary to get the measure passed to promise that. And with that, I have comments on the others too, but I'll stop now.
All right. Well, that was a very exhaustive
and I could be more
summary,
exhaustive.
and I really appreciate that. I think that's ultimately today, that's exactly the level of detail we need to get to. So thank you for that. And I said Mike would be next, but I realized Joel actually asked before Mike, so we'll do Joel and then Mike.
I imagine in the interest of group dynamics, I won't respond too much. I'll come with what I brought, and I'll add a few thoughts based on what I've just heard. Although I am just the tenor surprised that we would be coming at a vision statement that is inclusive and then using a document then to knock off everything from what other people around the table are interested in. So with that in mind, I'd like to see actually more items in the growth management category. One, and I imagine we'll hear more from some other folks at the table, we'd like to see that jurisdictions adopt mitigation ordinances for agriculture so that projects that are affecting ag land in jurisdictions that have it have a way to provide mitigation money for agriculture, because I see many projects both in the straw man and policies in here that will heavily affect what is some of the best farmland in the state. Also like to see more specific performance standards, as Ron had mentioned in the growth management part, as well as in the infill and TOD section. I am concerned that in the housing provision, affordable housing section, that there's a kind of a blanket statement that all parts within the urban limit lines are fair game. It's not all annexed land to those jurisdictions, so it's not all fair game, and that is subject to the vote of the people, and as well in other circumstances subject to environmental laws, and so we're not going to strip away what is in many ways other protections just because we need to meet some kind of debatable housing targets. We need to really focus on infill and transit-oriented development. I think the group can kind of has come to consensus on finding the right kinds of housing development that we can all agree on. I didn't create a storm above, so that's not me. I would like to point out in the industrial and commercial land use area that the word prohibit TEP investments that would support conversion of industrial sites to housing is very overly broad. I think it's good that we have in mind the way we look at job-generating uses, and I think it's really good that we focus on, preserving jobs in industrial sites, but those kinds of policies throughout the Bay Area have actually prevented housing from being built in places where it is appropriate, and there's a list of exemptions that other communities have, such as for 100% affordable housing and other things that would be a good balanced perspective on that particular policy. Under the planning for the future item, it would be nice to know when guidelines would be developed for allocating unexpected revenues. I don't think any of us would just say, sure, CCTA, you can do whatever you want with extra money. That's not the point of a TEP. It's not the point of having a constrained list. So I don't think. I get cut off. And then on the third point under that, allowing the CCTA board to review the expenditure plan every 10 years to accommodate new conditions on new technologies, also very, very broad, and would like to see that we don't do things like moving from one program that hasn't even been implemented into projects that may or may not have been approved by the voters, such as using transportation for livable communities to move to an EBART. I think that was a decision that was may or may not have been a good idea at the time, and now has provided a framework for further sprawl in East County. So those are a short list, but I hope we can keep our conversation to things that we can agree on and not on attacking provisions that are important for, I think, voters of Contra Costa, and ways that we can actually, as an EPAC, come to some level of consensus if that's possible. So thank you.
All right, next we have Mike, and then Linus, and Eric, and Joel, and Jack. You raise your hand. So, but now I've lost track of all the people. I said Mike, Linus, Eric, and then I said Joel, Jack, and Catherine. Sorry, Catherine. All right, Mike.
David, you didn't exactly announce moving on from the broad general conversation to the specific one, but we kind of have.
I see this as actually still broad,
okay.
in that we're not,
well,
at some point we'll switch and actually try and either go through these point by point or something else.
In any event.
But
so
I think at whatever level you want to comment is fine. And if it's down to this level,
I want to offer a general comment. I kind of feel like this list and to some extent this conversation is conflating vision, decisions to be made about what goes into the expenditure plan, and potential policies, at least in the sense of which I am understanding policies to be adopted, which is what I understand these potential policies to be are rules that will be written into the ballot measure that will, to some extent, tie the hands or guide future actions of CCTA and recipients of money from CCTA, right? So some of these things in here are kind of reflective of vision ideas that we had, which should in turn be reflected in the kind of projects and expenditures that get reflected in the expenditure plan, like the first two, for example. Limiting only to things that reduce GHG, limiting only to things that reduce VMT. We don't really need an evergreen policy written into the plan. We just, if that is the belief of the expenditure plan and the CCTA board and it's going to be supported by voters, then you just apply that filter to things that go into the expenditure plan. The growth management plan, on the other hand, is an evergreen policy that needs to be there forever to guide the expenditures. So, in my mind, the vision discussion was an attempt to find a greatest common denominator that reflected what everybody believed. And it didn't include things that are just anathema or toxic, but with a bias towards putting in as much as possible into the vision. My sense is this is the opposite. My sense is we should be guided by looking for the least common denominator of policies. Because the policies they're difficult to implement, they're potentially difficult for key stakeholders, both local government and advocacy organizations. And I think to a large extent, a lot of this stuff is just going to be dealt with through the selection of things that actually are going to get funded. So I guess that's my broad comment. I'll jump back in later when we start talking about the specific things.
I would want to say one thing in that regard, Mike, and to others as well, in case people are following this, is that I understand your point, but I'm not sure I completely agree. Insofar as, for instance, as you said, money will be both expended by CCTA on individual projects, large projects, but will also go to particularly cities in the county for implementing a number of other projects. So the rules, as you've, I think, very correctly said, that might be made through the things on here would both follow the large line items that are on the straw man or ultimately in the TEP, but would also possibly apply to the use of the smaller pots of funds when they get to the individual cities or the county. And so you could have a rule, and I'm not saying we should have this rule, but you could make a rule that says that TEP investments should result in a reduction in emission of GHGs, and you could make that a rule for the use of those funds as they go to repairing streets or building new streets or running transit services or any other number of things that are within pots, that are within the TEP. So I'm not sure I agree with you that once you allocate the money in the TEP, you don't need those rules anymore. I think at least some members of this committee have said we would like to see rules like that so that they would apply to the use of the funds by the agencies that receive the funds.
Yeah, I suppose that is true. A great deal of the objective of a lot of these policies can be accomplished through careful selection of the expenditures or definition of the program categories. And I think there's great risk in over-encumbering the process of CCTA over time and recipients with rules that don't necessarily add very much or any value.
Okay. The next speaker would be Linus.
Hi, Mike. I'll respond directly. I think there's actually great risk in one category here of not implementing more specific rules, and I'm referring to RAMP. And we're, in as much as anybody would endorse mitigation, we're interested in RAMP, and it does help everybody. It's a streamline effect. But the statement here is somewhat oblique, just to require participation. And as a general category, into the granularity of where RAMP should land, and at whatever time it's taken up, these monies should be expended as incentive for conservation to purchase new land. This is not to have a well of dollars when we're trying to encourage voter confidence and good planning and process in a limited funding environment to basically buy inventory of already conserved land. All of us as conservation organizations have a certain amount of inventory. How do we look to the future and have RAMP actually, with granularity, with actual rules basis, apply to a future vision of conservation with new lands, not as a bank account to take out old? I'll be interested in continuing to engage in that conversation as we get into the granularity of that. Thank you.
Okay, then I have Eric, Joel, Jack, and Catherine. So, Eric.
Just want to go back to something Dave alluded to earlier on choices, and from our perspective, would like to see something that implies that there will be healthy choices, such as active transportation, more funding for bike-ped mobility, and I think one of the concepts behind that would be to leverage potentially state active transportation dollars, cap and trade, and also perhaps planned barrier dollars. So just some acknowledgement that that's a choice and that's an option that would be part of the process.
Hi, Joel Ramos with Transform. Just wanted to respond to a little bit of the dialogue I've been hearing about growth. I think that Transform certainly is pro-growth. I would imagine everybody here is pro-growth. Raise your hand if you're not pro-growth. I think we all want to see growth. Raise your hand if you're pro-growth of the traffic that comes with growth. I don't think anybody wants to see that. I think that a lot of what we're running into, like where I'm from out in Bay Point, there's a terrific project that's been proposed on the corner of Willow Pass Road and Port Chicago Highway. And a lot of my friends and neighbors and family are adverse to it because to them all they see is more traffic. And I think that when we start talking about reducing VMT or limiting VMT expansion, what we're doing is we're trying to encourage and accelerate growth, which we're all supportive of, but without having all the side effects of that, which means more traffic. And I think that the intent of a lot of this needs to make those connections so that people can understand that, yes, a lot of us don't intend on ever getting into transit the way that it runs now. I think that if you have transit that comes after 8 o'clock or on Sunday mornings or at least more than once an hour, you might have more people wanting to take transit. But if it's only coming once an hour, it's hard to understand why it's empty. So I think that what we need to, it's easy to understand why it's empty. So I think my point is that I think that that a lot of us are going to be adverse to growth, period, unless we see the growth accommodated by way of VMT reduction in terms of transportation that comes with that growth, and seeing it complemented with transit. So I like where this is going. I just want to make sure that we're thinking about articulating how that growth ties to transportation and doesn't accelerate more VMT. And I don't know how we make that connection, but I know a lot of people are going to be looking for that as they look to vote for this. Because as I'm talking to my folks in my community, they're adverse to growth because of the traffic. Lastly, I want to make a point to what you said, sir, and what has been talked about, what Mr. Campbell said earlier about choices. And right now, people would say you have choices. It was insinuated earlier that people never intend to take transit. And right now, with the choices that you have right now, even though you have them, a lot of people will never intend to take transit. What we need are competitive choices. A lot of people would say you have a choice right now. I have a choice right now to take the train to San Francisco. That's fine. But a lot of us don't have those options because it's not affordable. And so affordability is something that I think that we should be thinking about more expressly too. But I need, as we talk about choices, I want to make sure that we really reiterate the fact that these choices are competitive with one another. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Then we have Jack and then Catherine.
Thank you. I'm sorry I wasn't here for the last session. I have 4 comments. I'll try to keep them brief. Under greenhouse gas emissions reduction, I would hate to think that we can't allocate money to fix potholes. That project can't demonstrate that fixing those potholes is going to reduce greenhouse gases. To me, we sort of have the environmental cart before the horse in that regard. Very concerned about the condition of our roads. Secondly, I agree with Lisa, any VMT reduction that's not picked to take into account population trends seems awkward to me. Third, and this is very important to me, I have served on many bond oversight committees, and I'm actively involved in the bond oversight process throughout the state. Any oversight committee that reports to the board that authorized it is not a citizens independent oversight committee. So having an oversight committee report to a CCTA, it cannot be an independent citizen committee. It should report to the public. My last comment, and this has to do with allowing the board to review and under special conditions amend the if anything that smacks of changing what the voters were told would happen with their money, based on ballot language that the voters was given, it really bothers me greatly. I absolutely don't support that. And we see evidence of this, unfortunately, all over the state in all kinds of ways. So if I'm misunderstanding that, I apologize. But that's the way it smells to me, and I very much doubt the Taxpayers Association, CODA, would support that.
Okay. Catherine.
Hi, I'm somewhat new to this process, so my comments will be kind of broad and perhaps somewhat of a question. And that's that, I thought that we spent a lot of time on our vision and goals and objectives, and yet when I got this document, it was really hard for me to understand how those two things were connected. So, for instance, when I look at the vision of values and objectives, I see, for instance, in number 3, a discussion of mitigating the impact of growth. And yet when I look at growth management, I don't see any discussion of mitigating the impact of growth. I also notice number 4, proactively linked transportation, land use planning, and the protection of industrial, agricultural, and open space lands. And I see only under industrial, preserve land identified as industrial and commercial, and nowhere do I see the protection of agriculture and open space. I also would note that under RAMP, that I believe that RAMP would cover habitat habitat mitigation, but it does not, because we do not have an agricultural mitigation policy in Contra Costa or in California. It wouldn't cover agricultural mitigation. So I would ask that agricultural mitigation be added to that section as well. And finally, just to note the greenhouse gas, the two greenhouse gas pieces at the beginning. I'll note that we have some really great data coming from surveys at UC Davis that show that, in fact, that strategic agricultural and open space protection can be an effective strategy in limiting and reducing vehicle miles traveled. And I'll also note that in addition to reducing vehicle miles traveled, our open spaces and agricultural lands give us a fantastic opportunity to offset greenhouse gas emissions with carbon sequestration. So I would suggest that we reference that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure there are others who would like to speak, and I want to have an ongoing open discussion as long as you all want to do it. But I also want to ask at some point soon if you feel like it might be productive to actually work through this list and talk about them one at a time, see how far we get, and then I've been taking some notes both of what people have said about individual items, and then I have 4 or 5 notes of additional items people asked to discuss, and we could discuss those also. But so I guess right now and Eric I know wants to make a few introductory comments when we start, if and when we start going through the individual policies. But so I'll call on you, Eric, when we get there. But let me ask first, are there others who want to speak generally? And whenever we're done with that, are people comfortable going through these, starting at the top with the GHG policy? So we'll have Peter, Joel, and then Kristen.
You want to hand them mic?
He's going to get 2.
World speech. This is just editorial, but I think it'll clarify the discussion somewhat. The representative to my right was raising the question of a conflict between greenhouse gas emission point at the beginning, conflict between that and doing pothole repair. We don't want that conflict. And it comes from the expression limit investments only to those that result in the reduction of GHGs. That's extreme. I'm a violent proponent of reducing GHGs, but that sort of exaggeration of language, excluding everything that doesn't do it, just gets us into trouble and muddies the debate. So I'd suggest there's a change of language there. Maximize DEP investments that result in the reduction, and similarly maximize investments that result in the reduction of VMT. But we can't exclude everything that's the least bit impure.
And I think those are great comments, and Eric likes them too. And at the same time, I do want to clarify that the intent of this document, unlike the vision, which you all have already adopted and which does say things like that, this is intended, as I think Mike said, to promulgate a series of rules that will tell where money can and cannot be expended. So a rule that simply says maximize reduction of GHGs, I don't think it's going to let CCTA staff know whether the project is fundable or not. And I'm not arguing in favor of a rule that says don't spend money unless it'll reduce GHGs, but the intent of this discussion is about are there any rules that you all want to suggest that would be so clear-cut as to say where money can and cannot be spent. And I personally would urge you not to make a series of rules that say things like maximize reduction of GHGs, because that's not going to tell Ross what he can and can't spend money on. I think either you decide you want to make a rule and you figure out what that rule is, or you say this is too broad an issue and we just can't have a rule about it. We understand the goal, but we're not making a rule about that goal. So you can talk about this further, but again, my understanding of this particular discussion is about what are the actual rules, if any, that you want to put in place on this as to how the monies will be spent. So with that said, I have Joel and Kristen and a bunch of furrowed eyebrows. Joel Betancourt.
Thank you. So I was not exhaustive, so I don't feel like the discussion is closed for a line item discussion.
No, I'm proposing that we do a line item discussion.
That's what I'm saying. I don't have an exhaustive list in here. So I don't feel like doing a line item discussion without an exhaustive list makes sense. I have a whole bunch of more stuff I'd like to see. I just gave you my highest.
Okay.
So if you want more, I'd be happy to give more, but I wouldn't be happy to give check or X to things quite yet. I'd love to have the discussion. I don't think it's there because I don't think we've all had an opportunity to see this for more than 18 hours of business hours to really kind of let it sink in. So that being said, I'd love to hear from you, David, how in your ideal world we're supposed to move forward with this, because I feel like this document has provided loggerheads to a degree we haven't seen before, and I'm not sure if we're going to make it out if we dig into the weeds right now.
That's what Eric's going to speak to in a minute. Kristen.
I think it's important, although it is uncomfortable to deal with. I wouldn't use the word loggerheads, but I do think that a fair amount of disagreement and airing those disagreements is going to be helpful to get us from the mom and apple pie vision to an expenditure plan that we are recommending to the authority to pursue, with some degree of certainty that our individual organizations and the umbrellas that we support will actually be in support of those things. And so I think that going, having this discussion, my question and my comment and suggestion now is that I would like to request a different facilitation style and process so that we have a group memory, that you can utilize I don't know if that was already your plan, that, the poster paper is up there, but I think that to help us deal with potential conflict and identifying how we're going to build some consensus and clarify confusion, that we need to have a little bit more of a group memory used in this section that I am looking forward to beginning.
But so to summarize one of your comments, I think you would be ready today to talk about these line by line. I heard Joel say that feels premature. Are you saying?
With the understanding that, there has not, I respect the kind of the comment and, I'll be honest, the complaint that we haven't had enough time to sit with this, but we do need to move it forward. This doesn't prevent anyone on the EPAC from, having some further reflection and saying, wait a minute, I didn't have a chance to vet this, but I feel like we do need to start that conversation.
Ron.
I'm going to go back a little bit to my earlier comment where I said I think there's a piece that's missing in between the vision and then this list that we're looking at today. And I'm going to say that I think it's a mistake for us to start getting into the items that are on this new list that we have, because as Joel just said, he's got stuff that hasn't even kind of made it to this table yet that he's going to want to get in there. And
just to clarify, Ron, you mean there's a not going list on the policy list, or are you talking going on the expenditure list?
The policy list, yeah. And then, even to have looked at a straw man expenditure plan earlier that came with the packet further kind of puts the pressure on to all of us to kind of start posturing for what we want to see in there. And oh my gosh, I'm worried that my piece isn't in there, and I better start advocating for that. So I want to try and take a step back again and just say, I don't know what that missing piece is, and the group memory piece that, is that what you called it, Kristen? Or whatever, shared memory. But I don't know if that's it, but there's something missing. And we worked pretty hard, I think, and very constructively to come up with a unified vision statement. And hopefully we all can say, yep, we agree to that. And what I'd like us to now do is to try and take it down to the next level of agreements with each other, of what we're trying to accomplish here. And maybe it's the policies, maybe it's taking the things that are on this list of expenditure plan, summary of policy concepts, and doing what Catherine suggested of going back to see how and where they do fit into the vision statement, or coming up with some other kind of way of codifying all of these things or organizing them in a way that gives us, again, at a high enough level that we can go around the table and actually all agree with each other that, yep, we think this is what we're trying to accomplish here. And for me, having been at the expenditure plan table in 2004, we actually had an EPAC that ultimately came out in near consensus, unanimous agreement about the expenditure plan because we took the time to incrementally develop the relationships and the understanding of what each of us were trying to accomplish as our most serious objectives. And once we understood that other people understood what we were looking for and we understood what they were looking for, we actually found a way of trying to accommodate each other. And from my perspective, that's what it's going to take for us to be able to come up with a winning formula that we've bought into and we can then go into the community and advocate for with one solid voice, because that's what it's going to take to get over the 2/3 hurdle. So in order, and I don't have the magic bullet or the exact recommendation to make here, but one of the things that I do feel is the ticking of the clock in my head for the timeline that I think we all think we're working on right now, and I think that works against us. To be able to get to December and have an expenditure plan that we're all happy with, I think that forces us to accelerate things at a pace that doesn't allow us to develop that understanding, that interrelationship, and that mutuality of what we're trying to accomplish here that will satisfy all of us enough that we're all willing to work on making it win.
Andy, you want to make a comment? I actually have some suggestions as to how we might proceed, but I do want to hear from all of you who want to speak. But I can try and do what, Ron, I think you've asked.
Yeah, I'll make this really concise because I know we need to move on. I think a discussion of these topics is probably beneficial in that we can find points that we might not agree on and find points that we're surprised that we do agree on. For example, I've never heard a taxpayer association make so much sense in my life, to be honest with you, and that's not something that I would normally say. But I think that we could talk about these points and come to lots of agreements that we probably wouldn't otherwise. So I think a discussion is good. However, and maybe Eric can speak to this, maybe you can speak to this, David, I'd like to know, because ultimately the plan, as Ron mentioned, is to come up with a document, an expenditure plan that we can submit to the CCTA board that has a general level of agreement from folks in this room. And getting the strawman TEP, I had a lot of questions, and I had some of those questions answered. So I'd like to know kind of what the relationship is between discussing these points and when we get to actually writing an expenditure plan with more fleshed out details and kind of what the give and take between that process is.
You're asking the give and take between the TEP itself, the dollar line items, and these possible policies.
I understand that these policies will go into influencing the decisions we make for the expenditure plan, but I think that there could be things that we include in the expenditure plan that maybe aren't specifically enumerated in these policies. Does that make sense? And I'm just kind of curious as which is more important and when do we get to the more important one, which I see as the expenditure plan details.
Well, to me, this goes back to Mike's question, and I tried to clarify it then, that I understand these, and again, we're not suggesting that you adopt all of these, but these would, if adopted, these would be independent rules that would govern how money is spent once it's put in the TEP. So, and again, I'm not saying that you would have this rule, but if you had that first rule on this page, limit TEP investments to those that result in a reduction of greenhouse gases, you would say, okay, I just put X amount of dollars into complete streets, but I now have a rule that says I cannot use that money on complete streets unless I can show that that complete street project will also lessen GHGs.
Okay.
And again, I'm not saying you would make that, I'm not being pro or
No,
con against that rule, but so in a sense it is independent. That is so, and it's dependent in that I've heard some people say, I could only support measure or project X if I know that there's also a rule that says we're going to mitigate ag lands. And that's where these things do come together, is that there's conditional support for certain projects and programs conditioned on certain rules being in place.
I understand. So in essence, there would be the expenditure plan, which would have, in an ideal world, fully fleshed out details with enumerations of where that money would go, projects, programs, et cetera, and a companion piece that would then dictate where the expenditure plan money was going to those entities that aren't enumerated in the expenditure plan. So this would be a codified document then included in the TEP.
Right. Okay. And I think Mike made another good point, which is mixed up in here. There's a second category which is peripherally related, which are possible changes to other rules, like the growth management plan. So the growth management plan was already adopted sort of in that same way. People said, I can pass this transportation measure if I know there's also a growth management program. And the growth management program was therefore enacted together. And there are things in here that are changes to that growth management program. So again, they're not rules about how to spend the money, but they are rules, and these would be changes to that set of rules, and those are intermixed here. I want to make this suggestion, and I'm making this particularly in regard to, Ron, what you said and what a couple of the others of you said, and Andy too. I think there's actually more agreement here than you all maybe all sense. And we've had a lot of good commentary on these individual items, and I certainly heard Joel and others say it seems premature to feel finished with this at all, but I would suggest that we at least start going through a few of these after Eric makes some preliminary comments. But we see if we can have a discussion on a few at least individual items that will, and maybe not take all of them, maybe take a few that many of you have already spoken to, and see if we can create a sort of consensus about that item that would give staff and consultants enough information to go off and noodle with this a little more and bring you back something that's a little more developed. And my sense is that at least on about half of these items, what I've heard today, I think you could get to a point of some consensus about where you want to head on those individual items.
May I make a small modification?
Please. And then I saw Catherine, too.
I think it might be more appropriate to maybe have that discussion as an agenda item, the last one, gives us some time to think about it, and that we do what I think many of us were prepared to do, which was look at the straw man today and give that as an opportunity to launch off for further reflection on the policies.
Okay, so you're suggesting doing that.
We agendize this policy discussion line item for the next EPAC, because that's before even the draft comes out. We still have time. And that we kind of focus on the straw man to do what that's intended today, to draw out some of the ideas and kind of back and forth.
So Joel's at least suggesting, I think you're saying we would essentially finish this item very soon, move on to item 2 and its constituent parts, and come back to this at our next meeting. So we'll take Catherine and then Kristen on that suggestion.
Yeah, my comment is that it's hard for me to understand how we could talk about these individual items when we know that this is an incomplete list. So for me, when I look at a list of, when I consider these items, I need to have a sense of what I'm comparing, a totality of what the different items on the list are. So I might modify slightly what Joel said and say that what we should get back in adequate time to review is this list with whatever additions people at this table believe should be on this list.
Okay, so you would want to do that, I assume, today to get the list to be more complete. I mean, we've certainly taken notes. I've got 4 or 5 additions. Debbie mentioned mobility management. Catherine, you and Joel both mentioned agricultural mitigation. We would add those items.
Well, I guess I feel a little less comfortable about that, given the fact that I thought that we had a vision, and then somehow the list that I got doesn't correlate with the vision. So, I don't know how this process works, but it seems to me that those of us that want to add something to this list should provide you something in writing, because something is getting lost in the translation. I mean, certainly something got lost in the translation between this vision and this list. So.
Okay, that's certainly an opinion, yes. Let me just say, we, having helped to put this list together, I wasn't I don't think any of us intended to take the 21 points in your vision and transfer every one of them into a rule, as these policies are intended to be. So there wasn't an intent to go to translate all 21 of these points into something you had here. So to the extent some of you expected that, I guess it was an incomplete response.
But there's whole large categories of things that are in the vision that aren't reflected in
Right,
the
and
rules.
so I would suggest we talk about those today. And some of you already have. You've talked about mobility management. You've talked about agricultural mitigation. Margaret talked about concerns about jobs. Those are some very clear policy areas that I think we can add because we've heard them from you.
I think,
Kristen.
yeah, so just in response, so, I mean, I would hope that, I guess, I think that it's helpful as a group process for us to get behind something and evaluate actual dollars and an expenditure plan is to have some common ground on which to sit, and that's where I see the value of the policy, that list of policies. I would hope that we don't get stuck in use of the word rule, because I don't think that, because I think that is constraining at this point. This will have to jump through so many hoops, and there needs to be polling and some other things, and we need to look at it. So I don't want us to be constrained that this list that's incomplete is a list of rules, but I think that it will be a more beneficial experience for us as a group. I just look at it really differently than Joel at this juncture, because I question the value of going through the straw man right now if we don't have a sense of what it looks like to make that vision real, which is what the goal of at least that's the goal of my interpretation of that policy list, even though it's incomplete, because if we have a discussion section by section, we can add those things. I want to hear from Ty, for example, about like what is mobility management, because if that should be something that we'll make that vision around people with disabilities, make that real. And so let's hear a little bit more about that, get a little smarter about it, and then apply that to the straw man. So.
And I agree with Kristen in that sense. I think my comments were using the straw man's already been made, and it's been made based on what we're seeing here. And I'm seeing no, and I agree with you, and I'd be happy to abandon the other one too. But I feel like that was generated using this list. And if this list is incomplete and that's incomplete, perhaps we can see what needs to be in the policy to end up at a straw man that we actually like. But looking at that as a set of missing pieces and working our way backwards, if that's the route forward, and perhaps that's too confusing. But my point is that I can't support a conversation right now when I don't have the materials to have a substantive conversation. And I think there's probably enough people around the table who, one, don't agree with don't feel like we're at a place to have the discussion, and two, that don't have the materials to have the discussion because they weren't prepared to do so. And so I just don't see what we're racing against right now that we can't wait 2 weeks for.
So I'm going to suggest at this point that we could do one of three things, and I'd like to take a straw vote as to which of them to do with relatively little additional discussion. So I think we could either agree to do what I said to do just now, right now, which is to walk through at least 4 or 5 of these and see if there is emerging consensus, and to do that now. The second item would be to agree to do that in 2 weeks, but right now to at least have the list that I think Catherine, or the discussion that Catherine alluded to make sure we get all the topics on the table so that the list is relatively complete when we meet in 2 weeks. And the third would be to stop now altogether on this and go straight to agenda item 2, with the goal of coming back to this next time, and that folks who want to suggest other policy issues can do so by email. And I think that's what Catherine had suggested. Are people comfortable choosing among those 3 options as to what to do right now?
What's the difference between 2 and 3?
In number 2, we will have a discussion right now about to try and flesh out any missing topics. In item 3, we will not have that discussion now, and it will happen through the submission of items by email. Are people comfortable selecting among those 3 things? I'll take that as a yes. All right. How many would like? No? Okay. What would?
There's probably a 4th option, which is maybe we ought to go home
Well, Ron, let me say in all due respect, I do this kind of facilitation for a living, and I am prepared to try and facilitate all of you in a discussion of these items, but I can only do that with your willingness. And I can promise you, if you all go home right now, we will absolutely not have moved this forward today. Now,
put out a fourth option just now, and you've debunked it before anybody can react to it. I don't think that's great facilitation, but that's just my opinion.
okay, I absolutely am about to put on the table that we can go home today, and we can reconvene in 2 weeks, and look at that point, I guess, both at our item 1 on today's agenda, the policies, and the straw man alternative. So that certainly is a fourth possibility of what we can do today. And I imagine there's a fifth and a sixth, and I'd be happy to hear those. Jack, and then Andy. I was hoping that we would take a vote and decide where to go, but okay. So let's have a short break as soon as Andy has spoken.
Real quickly. I don't know if the discussion of the policy concepts would preclude people from adding or subtracting anything to that list in writing going forward. I think if we have that discussion going forward, we can come up with things we agree on, and if people have additions to that list or things they would like to delete or additional comments, they could submit those in writing. And then in future meetings, we can codify that. We don't have to come up with a completed document today, but I think a continued discussion is good, and I'll leave it at that.
So you're suggesting we do my suggestion 1 with the understanding that it doesn't preclude people adding things later. Okay. So we'll have at least 4 options on the table when we come back. Let's take a 5 or 10 minute break, and we'll then see how we want to move forward. We are ready to reconvene. Could the committee members please take their seats? All right, thank you all for coming back so quickly. I think I'd like to, at this point, turn it over to Eric, who, well, quite a while ago said he had some comments for us on this, and then we'll figure out how to move forward.
Thanks, David. So I really appreciate all the struggle we're having, and this isn't the first time we've been through this type of process, and I also appreciate the fact that in this setting with microphones and the formality of it, it's really hard to get where we need to go. But what I really want to say is we need to get where it is we need to go. And by that, I mean we have to move beyond just stating the positions of our various organizations and what we want. And we have to move more towards what is it we think, from your particular perspective, how can we create a program here, a plan here, that we can live with and that will pass the voters and the cities and the county of this county, because if we just state our positions, we're never going to get to the real discussion. And I'm going to use this as an example, not to point anybody out, but we know we have strong views about growth management and how it should be strengthened on both sides of the equation. We have, I don't want to change anything, and we have, I want to make major changes. We can state those positions backwards and forwards until we don't get to a ballot measure, but we actually have to get beyond that. And that's not going to be easy. And what I'd really like you guys to think about is how is the best way for that conversation to happen. That's the conversation we need to get to. Not a conversation just about what you believe. How can we do it in a measure in a way that's going to work? And it really, in my view, doesn't matter whether we specifically go through each item or put it off or whatever. The bottom line is we have to get there, and we have to have that conversation sooner as opposed to later. This was not intended to be an all-comprehensive list. This was intended to point out, I can tell you, somebody who's been working on this for a couple of years, these are issues that have been out there for a long time. These are not brand new. The issues have been discussed about in different forums for a long time, and maybe some of you are seeing it for the first time. But the bottom line is, these are just some. It's not intended to be every policy issue, but we know that these are types of issues that can make or break this measure. If we don't have agreement, if we have the Sierra Club and the environmental community opposing this, or the Bay Area Council opposing this, or other groups opposing this, we're just going to lose. And that's easy for us to get to. Getting to agreement is that's the real work. And I just want to encourage, however you do it, to start that real process. Because that's what everybody says they want to do, but that's not really that's been happening yet. It's basically a restatement of a point of view. So I just want to encourage that, and to me that hopefully helps frame how you look at these options that David suggested or anything else, which is how are we going to get into that discussion. And if you think you can do it in this larger group, great. If you don't, you think you need to do it in another means, great. But we got to figure out a way to do it, or we're just not going to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And on that note, I want to say that at least on a few of these items on the list we're looking at now, the summary of policy concepts, I feel like I've heard enough of you speak that I could suggest to you what I think you would have that consensus about. So if you would like me to help facilitate that, I could. And I can also, and that was my suggestion number one, and I can also certainly defer to all of you so that you can think about it more, have discussions offline, and we come back and either talk about it in this forum or another forum at a future meeting. And I think that's the place we are right now, is trying to decide if you would like to try and do that today, and or if you would prefer to defer that. And so we can have some further discussion about that. I did write down some notes as to the four options that were on the table when we went on our break. We could take a vote about those now, or we can have some more discussion. But obviously, we need to decide how we want to move forward today, or if we want to end the meeting right away. So, people want to have a little more discussion about that, or just take a straw vote? How do you want to move forward right now?
Channeling Jack Weir, I'd love to just move on with the agenda to the next item, please. This was not agendized.
Okay, so I hear that as a vote to do what was my number 3. I'll go ahead and turn the sheet over. Number 3 on here is to proceed to item 2.0 and to be done with item 1.0 for now. So that's one point of view. And I think we'll take a quick straw vote whenever we're ready with that. But certainly that's Joel's position. Does anybody else want to speak to that, or are people comfortable deciding on one of these 4? Tim?
I don't have a problem with trying number 1. I don't know if I want to go 4 to 5, but I'd be happy to try it, at least with one issue, to see where we go and what kind of dialogue ensues, to see whether or not that's even a legitimate process in order to move us forward.
Okay. Other points of view. Pat?
In a selfish mode, because I have 2 quick items I'd like to reference, I'd like a quick 2 and then proceed to 3.
Okay. Ron?
Yeah, since I feel some sense of authorship on item number 4, I'd like to suggest that wasn't quite as abrupt a suggestion as it is presented on the board, and it was rather to take a break, whether that's to end today, but some kind of a break in order to kind of take stock of where we are and what we're trying to accomplish, and whether the methodology we are currently utilizing to get to that endpoint is actually the correct methodology, or whether there's an incremental step or group approach that might help to recodify, reorganize, and restructure the nature of the kind of conversation we would have that would lead to the kind of consensus we're trying to achieve on the creation of an expenditure plan with its programs, projects, and its policies, all really thoroughly constructed. So,
all right. So, are you comfortable having a vote on these 4 items? And if so, would you like number 4 to read a different way? Since I absolutely agree, you were the author of that point.
Well, I think I just said what my intent of number 4 was a redefinition of the process that we're utilizing.
Okay. Okay. So I'll put it down as redefine the process. Would that be a good shorthand for it? Okay. All right. Are people feeling ready to choose among these 4 options? Mm-hmm. Okay. How many would like to try, as Tim said, at least one item on this list and see how a facilitated discussion would go? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All right. How many would like to only have a discussion of new items that need to go on this list and then finish it to proceed to item 2.0? 1 for that. How many would like to go now to item 2.0? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And how many would like to redefine the process? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So I think that's actually a majority. 12 to 10 would like to do number 1. So I think we'll at least try 1 and see where we end up. Correct. Thank you. All right, so I would like to begin with the first one because we actually had a fair amount of discussion about that. And so what I'm going to do is say what I think I heard, and then you all, I trust you all will respond to that and quite possibly correct me. But what I heard from this as that greenhouse gas reduction is a very important overall goal of public policy in general in the state of California, and in Contra Costa County is a public policy goal that needs to be implemented through this overall package, that the overall package in the expenditure plan should be vetted against greenhouse gas emissions, and that we should check through that process, presumably in the EIR, to make sure that this package can be predicted to lessen greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, it's probably not possible to go further and make a rule about individual projects, because there are, for instance, projects, Jack Weir, who had to leave, mentioned pothole fixing. It might be hard to show that fixing a pothole is going to lessen GHG emissions, and that's very important to do. Lisa said that her organization, at least, would see this as applying to the whole plan, but not individual projects. And that was a sense that I got that others shared. So that my sense would be that this is one that we would note as a very important goal overall, very important that the plan in general be calculated to show an overall reduction in GHGs, but that we not make a further policy about individual buckets or individual projects that would be funded under this TEP. Comments? Peter, and then Pat.
I think this should be put a little less negatively. The TEP should. Yes, we need a microphone. I think we should be less negative and less cautious, less defensive, bureaucratic in our language. The TEP throughout should reflect a major policy turn by the county to reduce greenhouse gases, and as necessary to evolve its way of life to accomplish that goal. And among other things, we should trust the civil servants, the bureaucrats who are going to carry this out, to understand it and to carry it out. And I think we should get away, frankly, from the idea of rules. There's an old saying that the U.S. Navy, giant machine that it is, was designed and created by geniuses to be operated by idiots. And I think we should get away from that here. We are not geniuses, and the CCTA is not composed of idiots. We should allow them some latitude, but we should also make sure that they understand the central intention.
Right. And that central intention, again, was what I said, that the overarching, we have a goal to reduce GHGs, and we're going to check the overall plan to make sure that it appears to accomplish that.
Yes.
Great. Okay, Pat.
I guess I was looking at it from the context of, yes, the package should reduce GHGs, but no individual project should make things worse. You know, using the medical model, or if an individual project for some reason will make GHG emissions in that area, community, whatever, would make it worse, there has to be some sort of overriding justification. One of the things that a lot of people often forget is that fixing potholes is good for transit as well as for cars. If we have better, smoother buses running on smoother streets, maybe people will ride it more cheerfully than they are not doing now. So I think we need to look at that perspective as well.
Andy?
Yeah, thank you. I actually agree with Peter, a lot of what he said, and I think those were excellent points, as well as Pat. And really, I just wanted to jump in here to correct some misinformation, and that's the fact that pothole repair does a great deal to reduce greenhouse gases. It may not makes sense on the surface, but not only because it will induce more people to ride transit, but just the resurfacing of streets will cause cars to go smoother, and we have studies that show that will reduce overall greenhouse gases. I think Peter's comment to not apply this to specific projects makes sense, as well as not make things worse. But I did just want to correct that one piece of information that reducing GHG and fixing potholes can coexist in a nice little environmental environment.
Okay, so I've got my back here. I'm trying to write notes of what I'm hearing from people. And I'm not sure if there's another speaker.
Catherine.
Okay,
Yeah, it's Catherine. I'd just like to note that in addressing climate change, there's more strategies than reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there's also carbon sequestration. And I would recommend that when we address greenhouse gases, we should also protect lands that sequester carbon.
That's a great comment. Mike, did you want to add? I'm trying to summarize here the points directly related to GHG reduction.
I feel like they just make
How would that happen? How would that happen?
that investments are made in a way that protects lands that are appropriate for CHG.
Yeah, let me help with. Maybe I should be a little clearer. Ron was just saying that too. Is that we know that one of the big impacts that we can have is all of our open spaces and rangeland in particular, and also irrigated agriculture sequester carbon. Our forests, our rangeland, our agricultural land, our parks and open spaces, and so the strategy. We need a multitude of strategies to deal with climate change. And particularly, there's science showing, in particular, and Eric, you might, want to speak to this because I know that the Regional Park District is working on this as well, is that, in particular, there's ways to manage rangeland that can have an enormous climate change impact. So I would think that in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to want to protect those lands that sequester carbon.
So how do we do that in this measure? I just don't understand how we would do it in the measure. You just explain, so I understand. Explain how we,
Through RAMP, by protecting open space and agricultural lands.
So you're suggesting then, as part of the transportation measure, and I understand RAMP is mitigation, that there be some kind of open space acquisition program as part of the measure?
A protection program.
And the way we...
That's part of the growth management.
And the way we dealt with that in 1988 was Measure AA, where the Park District put on its own measure to protect open space, because we couldn't directly link the purchase of open space to a transportation measure. So I'm trying to understand how we're going to do it here in a way that would work. I understand RAMP. Yeah.
I would like to suggest, and I want to hear from Joel immediately, but I would like to suggest that we note that as an item and Joel and Catherine have already noted this as an item, that we need to get on this list and come to it today. I do want to, if we can, take these one at a time. If all of these things are closely interrelated, so it will help us to move forward if we can go one at a time, as opposed to trying to cover them all at once. So my goal would be to note that as a very important additional item. I want to acknowledge that it's not even on the type list you have, and note that we will get it on it, and then we will come back at some point as one of about 10 or 15 items. It will be one we discuss as soon as we can get through with the other.
Well, she brought it in the context of GHG reduction.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I will promise to only make process comments once, and now will be the time. This is exactly why we're not ready for this conversation. You just had 5 minutes at the end of the last EPAC meeting on the RAMP, and if you don't understand the RAMP, you had 2 weeks to understand it by today. That's to staff. And we should have had, as the EPAC, a great deal more discussion on that. It was at the very end, and it was essentially stunted. And I don't know for what reason. So I'm not sure if people still have questions about RAMP, and it'd be great to talk about that again. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about this. And two, that the idea that if people are going to suggest things, they should go up there first before someone makes a calculation of whether or not there should be up there. So please just have someone who's willing to just write stuff, and then we can come back to it and deal with it later, but not make judgments about what list it should be on. If it's under one topic item, just put it up there.
I just had a question. I mean, because you just came out really strongly about admonishing staff about not understanding RAMP, but I actually heard Eric's question in the context of how can we link acquisition of additional open space as a greenhouse gas reducing strategy because of was that what you were asking? Okay.
The point is that the ramp conversation that was supposed to happen at the last EPAC should have covered exactly that point, and I'm not admonishing staff. I'm just saying if we're going to talk about specific proposals today that we had limited time to do the last time, that it shows that we need a little bit more time to present these items rather than rushing through to try and describe them. Does that make sense? The idea of an acquisition strategy is the RAMP program will, yeah, exactly. So you have a plan, what lands to conserve, you do your GHG reductions by targeting investments to places that can do carbon reduction. So that's the equation. As mitigation, yeah.
That's as mitigation for the additional greenhouse gases that are being generated as a result of the projects that are being done. And so you mitigate part of that through the carbon sequestration through the RAMP program that protects and sets aside more protected open space lands and grasslands.
And you avoid projects that convert land that sequesters carbon.
Mike.
So I don't feel ready for a conversation about RAMP, which is way down at the end of this list. I do feel ready for a conversation about the first bullet point on here, which is kind of what we started off on. And I thought Peter put it perfectly. I mean, perfectly explained what was in my mind. So I think what's appropriate is a guiding statement about an intention and goal to limit or reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector and from this expenditure plan, a set of investments and programs that can be shown to accomplish that, but not micromanaging the operations of the CCTA staff in any way that's not going to add any value to that. And David, you said something to that effect in your kind of opening statement, what you thought might be the basis of a consensus. But my question is, for those who feel really strongly about this, where does that statement and commitment live? If there's not a policy that says, everything's got to reduce greenhouse gas, reduce greenhouse emissions, where does that statement about the commitment of the expenditure plan and of CCTA and of the voters to accomplish this outcome, where does it live?
Eric, correct, or Ross, I think that the answer to that is that the measure will have certain overarching policy principles built into it, that was the case in both 88 and 04, and that we can put into the measure statements like that it is an overall goal of the plan to reduce greenhouse gases, that no individual project should emit more greenhouse gases, that whatever those statements are, those can be written into the overall language of the plan as policy guidance as opposed to allocation rules.
Well, actually, I think what David's saying is correct, but it could actually apply to an allocation rule. Some of the categories don't have every project defined at this point in time, so it get defined over time. So it could be a combination of what we use to select investments now, and then it could be something that would be a requirement for projects or for programs that are not fully defined.
It could be. I mean, Peter's suggestion that I think, which I agreed with, was that it not be a specific evergreen rule that's applied to each allocation of funds. My question was just, if that's not an explicit rule, that I think there's many constituencies that are going to want to see that there's a commitment nonetheless, and I'm just trying to understand where that is. And I hope we're not getting into. I hope that then doesn't lead us into a whole additional parallel conversation about a set of principles to be in the measure, and then a set of policies that will guide expenditures. That's going to give us 4 whole sets of things to work on, which I think is going to be beyond our scope.
Well, and that's where some of this discussion is going. What was really intended for the discussion today was towards those set of allocation rules, as you described them earlier. And it seems like, and maybe appropriately so, some folks want to use this broader. But if it's a way that Peter described it, it probably would be in some aspirational statement in the opening of the measure.
So I have notes up here with 4 or 5 points, and I did try and capture the point that Catherine and Ron were making at the end, that greenhouse gas reduction is an important overall goal. We will calculate reduction for the entire plan. As Pat said, no individual project would make things worse in terms of GHGs. Possibly, I mean, at least implicitly to state that there's no need for an individual allocation rule, but that these 3 principles apply in addition to this last principle, that there would be some sort of mitigation program to offset any increases, and that might include RAMP or other methods of mitigating any greenhouse gas increases that occur from some projects, that they can be offset by other projects that sequester carbon or do other things to reduce greenhouse gases overall. Is this, now, and obviously this isn't done, but is this something that presents an overall direction that staff could take and try and write up into something that would come back to you for consideration? Pat?
I guess I'm just really concerned about how the last bullet would really work to not contradict the 3rd bullet.
Mm-hmm. I have that question also. I heard very strongly from Ron and Catherine and Joel that they wanted to see something like this here. We could deal with it later when we talk about overall mitigation, but I heard from Ron, Catherine, and Joel that they wanted to see a statement here that even though we want to try and avoid projects that would generate additional GHGs, we also want to know that there is a mitigation program in place.
Actually wasn't what I said at all, and it may have been what some of my, some other people at the table said. I was more headed on we should avoid projects that take lands that sequester carbon.
Okay, so.
And it's not just ag land; it's open space and parklands. Open space as well.
And the second part of that is the other part, which is that every project has the potential for greenhouse gas analysis, and it could either reduce, not add, or it could add. Cumulatively, we probably understand that projects tend to increase greenhouse gases, and so we want to mitigate for the impacts of that, and we do that through, and this is part of the RAMP program, which is anticipating that and having a mitigation program that protects lands that will help with the sequestration of those gases.
So Eric's saying, does that mean any project that might increase GHGs cannot be funded through this measure? And I think, Ron, I don't think anyone at the table said that. I think that what people have said is that it is an important overall goal, and that we understand that some projects may have some effect. Yeah, I still am needing to understand that too. So Pat did suggest that. On the other hand, if you make a new interchange, you may find additional traffic moving through that interchange. Increased bus trips, Eric doesn't have the microphone. Increased bus trips, Eric says, could by themselves create additional GHGs. Right. I had thought at the outset that it would be the overall goal and that we'd want to ensure reduction for the overall plan, and that it was probably going to be difficult to tie individual projects to that same standard. I did hear some committee members saying that every individual project should be tied to that standard. Andy?
Yeah, I think that that's probably right. And I think in reference to the first point as an important overall goal, I think that that's true. I was under the impression that when we first started this process, you told us that these were going to be codified, quote-unquote, rules to live by and clear direction to give to staff. If we change this from limit TEP investments, et cetera, whatever language you want to use, to it is an important goal, I think that nullifies the intent of what this list set out to do. And if that's the case, we should just take it off.
I think that my personal opinion is you could just take it off, but I think there are other people at this table who would, rather than saying we're going to just take it off, they want to be sure we still understand it as an important goal, right. And that's why I put this that way.
And I think you're absolutely right that it needs to be understood as an important goal. I thought that when we started this meeting, the difference between the vision, goals, and objectives that we codified before and adopted as this committee versus this particular set was that one was an overall vision that gave direction to staff, direction to the CCTA board in developing an expenditure plan, and one was supposed to be very specific inclusions or disinclusions of projects or programs based on a set of criteria. And if the set of criteria can't reach that, if that's not a measurable goal, for example, you can't measure an important overall goal, you can give that direction to staff and say, please have this in mind when you develop the TEP. But if that's not the point of this set of guidelines, then we should delete it from the set of guidelines.
Okay, so there's a point of view that says that all of this discussion, and Andrew's going to start taking notes too if there's additional items, but that all of this discussion points to that on this particular item, we can note all these things as being important, but understand that it really means that there doesn't need to be such a rule and move on. So that's a point of view. How do other people feel about that? Lisa?
Ross, isn't it true that that the entire expenditure plan that is adopted by the CCTA ultimately goes into the next CTP, the Comprehensive Transportation Plan, which is subject to the GHG rules? So it doesn't really matter what we say here in that sense, in the sense that the GHG rules will be applied to whatever comes out of this process. Yeah. The question is do you want to make those requirements stiffer than what the state is already going to require?
Right.
Is that accurate?
You're absolutely correct. So last time we talked about the analysis we're doing on 3 investment options, and the fourth option that we'll look at is the CTP with the TEP included, and we will do an analysis of that and release that in January. So that is correct.
All right. Well, I heard a very concrete proposal from Andy, so I think I want to kind of try and move forward from that. Andy suggested that the sum total of this, all of which is very important as a goal, as a framework, in the end does amount to that we would not have it be an item that is an additional policy or rule in terms of the allocation of individual line item funds. So that's a concrete proposal on the floor, and I'd love to hear a reaction to that. Joel?
At the least, I'd like to see this document reiterate language, because as we know, when we don't do redundancies over and over again, people forget that they exist in the first place. It would be great that the policies in here acknowledge state, regional, and local laws to reduce greenhouse gases.
Okay.
At the very least.
And you're saying at the risk of it being redundant, go
Correct.
ahead and say it.
Go ahead and be redundant.
All right. Andy, could you live with that as sort of a friendly amendment?
Yeah, I think reiterating the fact that everything in the expenditure plan has to comply with state and local regional laws. you can include that 20 times if you'd like. I absolutely agree that that's important.
Okay.
Sure.
So we have an emerging proposal that would say that we understand it to be very important. We reiterate that we're going to comply with state, federal, and local law in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, and that we're going to state that in whatever policy document we come up with, but we're not going to try and create any further policy that's more specific about allocation of funds relative to GHGs. Pat.
I hear that being translated as dare to be mediocre.
Okay, so you're not comfortable with that, is what I'm hearing.
I think we need to reduce as much as possible, and if we exceed the minimum requirements, those who have children and grandchildren might appreciate it.
Andrew, I want to ask you to write these 3 points down, and I want to try and say again what I think Andy was saying, because I don't think anyone in this room disagrees with your point either, Pat, and maybe we can put it in a preamble. But point number one is, and I think this is where your point comes to, point number one is GHG reduction is an incredibly important overall goal. And we do not want to be mediocre. We want to exceed what's been done before. We want to do the very best that we can. And I don't know how strongly, we cannot say that strongly enough, but that is number one. Number two is that from a policy perspective, we're going to follow federal, state, and local regulations and comply with those in all respects. And we're going to restate that at the risk of it being redundant. And that number three is that once those two things are in place, we're not going to try and use GHGs as a further rule maker as to how funds will be allocated beyond whatever happens in the TEP itself. Catherine. Oh, go ahead.
Andy just mentioned this too, but it's maybe worth reiterating for people that, that just GHG reductions are also the law at state and local levels. So if we could maybe just reemphasize that, we might be capturing everybody's concerns and goals, not to mention 350 that was just passed at the state level. So I just wanted to remind everybody of that as we continue to discuss this.
Okay, I'm going to go back to a foundational question that I think might be similar to Mike's question. And once again, I apologize because I've never been through this process and I'm new and I'm trying to understand it, and I'm kind of embarrassed that maybe I had suggested something that was inappropriate based on Eric Zell's comments. I guess I am confused about exactly what we're doing here. Now, I understand that there's the transportation tax measure, and we're trying to decide how that money is going to be expended. And I understand that return to source funding at the last measure was tied to a growth management plan. So those pieces I understand, and I've read the growth management plan from before, and I understand about the expenditure. But this list of things that we're talking about now are things that are beyond anything that would be in a growth management plan. And the things that we're talking about right now with greenhouse gas reductions, where does this live? Where is this? What exactly are we talking about? And I'm sorry for such a fundamental question, but I want to make sure that my comments are appropriate.
I think it's a great question. I'll try and answer it some first, and then maybe Ross can add. I think the short answer is that there's not a place where these things have lived necessarily before. There are 2 or 3 places where they can live. They could be, as we already said, a kind of preamble within the measure that goes before the voters that will set overall goals and intention. Number 2 is they could get written into the growth management program that already exists. Number 3, which is what my primary focus had been today, and I think maybe there has been some confusion about this, but number 3 would be to make individual rules about how funds would be further allocated. So, some folks have said if we're going to do any street projects, they should only be complete street projects. That's something not that everyone said, but some people have said that would be a rule like that could get written into the measure. So those are three kinds of places: overview within the growth management program or rules regarding allocation. And what the suggestion from Andy has been is that this first one about GHGs would probably be in the overall preamble. Of course, we'd follow the law, and that we don't need further rules about the allocation of funds.
Okay, so I think that it might clarify this conversation enormously if we discussed those in three different buckets. Things that we want in a preamble, things that might constrain actual allocation of spending, and things that would be in a growth management plan.
Mm-hmm. That might be a very good way to move this discussion forward. Ron.
Yeah, I think just for some clarity here, growth management has been one of the key policies that's been contained in the prior measure. That isn't the only kind of policy we can have, and a policy is not necessarily a rule, and it's certainly not part of a preamble. And I think one of the things we're talking about possibly is the creation, as we look down this list, the need for creating another policy or two that in fact help to lead to the kind of transformational measure that we're trying to make this.
Right.
And that's, again, part of that middle ground between the vision statement that we created and coming up with an actual expenditure plan.
So that, and I don't think these would be in numerical order, but that would be a fourth category. So we've got the category of going in a preamble or an overview. We've got the category of going in the growth management program itself, and I can't see what Andrew's writing. That's a funding allocation rule, and then a fourth would be a separate policy, but sort of at the growth management plan level, but a non-growth management policy that might get enacted as part of this also. All right, so I am wanting to try and bring some closure here because I promised maybe we could get, I said 4 or 5 done, but we might get 1 done. Catherine, I really appreciate what you've said about that, maybe talking about this in these regards is helpful. So I think where this comes down is we've got a preamble or goal that this is important overall, very important overall goal. We've got an understanding that from a policy perspective, we're going to follow federal, state, and local laws. It's not something that we would put in either in these categories B, C, or D of making an additional allocation rule or an additional policy, or in the growth management plan. What are people's thoughts about that approach obviously on greenhouse gases only? I mean, we've still got at some point a long list of other items to come to. Comments about that? Joel.
So, and I'm not wed to this idea, but I'm just trying to help move the conversation forward. What about the concept of when we start talking about criteria and performance criteria in allocating and judging projects, what have you, as they are competing with one another, would it work to include something like greenhouse gas reduction potential as part of criteria in a performance evaluation? Is that something that we could think about and then actually have that? I mean, since it is an overall goal that everybody's agreeing to, I'm wondering if that would be a viable approach. Not so that it's like a rule, like Mr. Leiden was saying, but if it could be part of one of many criteria that we're evaluating.
Ross is whispering to me that performance measures, is what Andrew would write there, would be possibly another future topic, because I think what we don't know for sure is which of these pots of funds, if any, would be subject to those kinds of performance measure-based analysis. Traditionally, for instance, I think it's fair to say return to source money has not worked that way. It's gone to the local jurisdictions for them to use as they like. It hasn't been competed for. It is possible that some of these pots of money could become pots that local jurisdictions compete for. Under the current measure, Ross, are there some of the pots that currently are competed? So which would those be?
TLC and some of the ped bike are competitive.
So, yeah, and maybe we should put that as item E on that list on the far right, is that could be another place to put it, is where there are competitive programs, maybe this could be a performance measure. Okay, so, and Hoyle, that's a further suggestion from you that then maybe does get listed here as well as number 4 is GHG reduction. In those programs that are competitively scored, GHG reduction would be considered as one of the criteria. So that would be number 4 over here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so then with that list then, so again, it's an important overall goal. We are going to follow federal, state, local laws. We're going to include it as a performance measure for competitive funding, and that we're not going to try and do items B, C, or D on the right-hand list. Is that moving towards a treatment for greenhouse gas reduction? I'm going to suggest that maybe we're getting close to a place where we could take this away, work on it, and bring it back to you next time for consideration. I certainly understand, this is new ground we're covering, so I understand if we're not ready to make a decision today. Andy? So what's that? So, GHG reduction. So Ross has pointed out or has confirmed that there are right now in Measure J a few pots of money which are awarded competitively to individual projects. Not all of them, not return to source, for instance, but the 2 we mentioned were TLC and some PED bike projects. That we're saying that to the extent that those competitive categories remain, and we haven't gotten there yet, we don't know which of the categories will be competitive, but to the extent that there are competitive categories, GHG reduction would be considered as one of the criteria in scoring those projects. One of the criteria. Not the only criterion. Okay, so I'd like to suggest that we do 2 things with this. One, that we write this particular item up for your consideration, but then that we also do some work to write this up as a framework from which to discuss the other items. And staff could even take a first cut at assigning them, or at least make some sort of matrix that all of you can use to do some assignment of each of the items that are on this sheet, in addition to whatever other items we've added today, ag mitigation, mobility, making sure that those are covered, and then that we think about them from the perspective of these 5 items, and that we'll do that hopefully at our next meeting. And we'll write up this one as both an example and I think a preliminary outcome. Right, and we certainly are still missing some. I mean, I'm guessing. We heard a couple of suggestions, mobility management, some issues about labor and job quality, and ag mitigation, ramp, and carbon sequestration. Those are some that need to be added. Does anybody else want to throw any others out that they want to say right now need to be added? We can also take those as comments over the next week or so and get them in the packet for next time. But if anybody wants to add any now, we can. Pat?
Just so we don't lose it, transportation for seniors and people with disabilities is not the same as mobility management. Mobility management is a way, way bigger umbrella or bucket or whatever you want to call it, but it includes all of the human service transportation. It includes a lot of normal, quote-unquote, average commute trips, the whole transportation network stuff. It's the full package of options for movement for people from one place to another. A piece of it is transportation for seniors and people with disabilities. So I don't know what Debbie had in mind, and Ty may want to clarify what he thinks was meant, but those are they're 2 very different concepts.
What do you want to make sure we include in the discussion next time?
Well, what I wanted to bring up was state of good repair, especially on the transit side. There's nothing even vaguely that I can identify in the straw man that talks about state of good repair.
State of good repair. Can you define what you mean by that?
Fix it first. Make sure that the systems keep running in a humanly usable condition.
Okay.
It means making sure, for example, that you have transit that is usable and workable for the people who are trying to use it now, and that it doesn't deteriorate.
Okay, and so you want to discuss that as essentially, Ross has been saying without the microphone, fix it first as a possible policy, and contradiction to or comparison to building new stuff before we've fixed first what we have now. So you would like to see that as one of the policy discussions.
Yeah, and
right.
Just as a quick item, it is likely to be an important component of being able to leverage with federal funds.
Okay, great. Other items that people want to make sure get covered in the discussion next time? Yeah, Ty.
I just want to comment on what Pat referred to. You know, in some places, mobility management is all-encompassing, but Contra Costa just produced a mobility management plan, and it specifically addresses the needs of seniors, people with disabilities, and low-income individuals, and is a means of getting agencies and programs to coordinate with one another in order to reduce the cost and provide choices to individuals. It's not this grandiose thing in our plan, and the plan was produced for Contra Costa County.
So we'll get that on the list for discussion next time, too. Other items? Peter?
Programs to encourage the diffusion of electric vehicles. The county will do everything it can to accelerate the conversion from fossil fuel to electric vehicles.
Okay. So Andrew's writing those on a smaller piece of paper. Maybe put them up here, too, so people can remember that we've got them all. So we had the fix it first or state of good repair, we had mobility management, and we have diffusion of electric vehicles. Yeah, Andy?
I was just curious how all of these discussion items are going to be included or not included in a final presentation. By just thinking about majority vote, or is it unanimous? It goes on, not unanimous, it doesn't go on.
I think in the end, if we have to, we will take majority votes, but so far we've actually avoided that. We haven't made tremendous decisions so far, but we have gotten the vision and goals in place, and we did that by acclamation and consensus. I'm hopeful that we were moving towards a consensus on these items here, and so if we, over the next couple of meetings, if we need it, we'll take majority votes, but I'm hopeful that most things will be with more of a consensus. Any other items you want to get on the list that Andrew is writing that are things to be sure we talk about when we look at policy items? Joel.
So is this totally any other items or just on GHG?
No, on any policy item. Any policy item that you want to, so things that we're going to discuss, where'd your other list go, Andrew? Under here. Things that you think might be need to be included in a preamble or overview, be additions to the growth management plan, be separate policies, be funding allocation rules, or performance measures for allocation of funds that are not yet on this sheet. And you can submit those in writing over the next week. Cheryl.
So from labor, I want to just make sure job creation and quality jobs are
yeah, the three that Margaret said were no subsidies for privatization, emphasizing made in California or made in USA, and emphasizing quality jobs and following a model that ACTC has.
So, which is still in development, so we might have to branch out models. But, you know, I think there's some local job creation, some equity questions in there, you know, pathways for folks into good jobs in Contra Costa County that we would like to see these public dollars be used for. You know, I thought about it with electric vehicle incentives. There's a lot more electric vehicles in high-income areas of the county than in low-income. So are there programs that could help in these areas that are also, they have worse air quality, right? So are there ways to target some of these funds in areas that need the most help?
Okay, so targeting of funds to low-income areas and providing pathways to quality jobs are two that I'm hearing you adding. Yeah, separate items. Okay, other items we want to get on this list? Bob or Mary, sorry.
I don't know if this, just to go with the public transit investment in Fix It First, just also programs that support youth, youth bus pass, any programs that encourage youth to become the new generation of transit riders. So just youth programs, I guess, for public transit.
And again, I want to be clear, we're talking about, I'm going to pull this piece of paper away from you. We're talking here not about buckets for the TEP, and the TEP does include seniors and youth and others on it, but we're talking about this question of, do they need to be in a preamble or overview? Do they need to be either growth management policy or other kinds of policy? Do they need to be funding allocation rules, or do they need to be performance measures for the evaluation of projects in competitive funding? Ron?
So that last one there, performance measures, does that go back to what was mentioned earlier in terms of having performance standards and then methodologies for monitoring, evaluating, and enforcing? Or is that different?
I think that's actually on this white list, that there's a, under enforcement of accountability requirements, going sort of from one page to the next, there are some items that we'll come to about review of reporting and monitoring and audits by an independent oversight committee. And
so that's on the list that we're going to discuss at some point.
At some point in our next, we've got 6 hours of meetings together still, yes.
Okay, and then the other question is the specific policies around growth management. We had talked at some point about a discussion.
Yes, and we've got a beginning list of those that are in the middle of this page, and we can certainly, if you have others that you want to see discussed, we can do those also.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get an understanding of how we've gone from an in-depth conversation on this and now this list, and then where we're going to have these other in-depth conversations.
Right. We've gone back up to the higher level because we did the one at an in-depth level, and we agreed we were going to end the discussion in depth, but then we said we should identify items that need to be discussed in depth later, and that's what we're doing now. Catherine?
Yeah, I'm just also, okay, so if we went back up to a higher level, then these that Andrew's writing down now are in addition to the things we talked about at that higher level before, right? Because it's not an all-inclusive list of our higher level things, and so I'm a little confused. We've got that list. Where's our other list of the higher level things that we talked about earlier?
I'm not sure Andrew wrote down ramp and carbon sequestration, and I think he should have added ag mitigation.
It's not just ag mitigation. If we look at our it's the stuff we talked about before. My first set of comments was that this vision talks about the mitigating the impact of growth, protecting industrial, agricultural, and open space lands. So, we talked, I had a series of comments earlier that would appear on that list, it seems to me, and I don't want them to be dropped off.
Okay, I'm sorry, I will have to ask you to repeat them because it sounds like we don't have them. So, Andrew, go ahead and write these down. We did get ramp and carbon sequestration, and I want you to add ag mitigation right there, but Catherine's saying that there's more than that. So if you could add ag mitigation, and then we'll ask her to list the others that we've apparently missed.
Well, I'm sure you have them in your minutes. You have them in your transcription. We all went around the room and had general comments that we added. It's not. I don't think it's just me. I think there was a bunch of us. But mitigate the impact of growth and protect industrial, agricultural, and open space lands. And once again, this is very confusing to me because I don't know which part of this is for a preamble and which part of this is growth management and which part of this is a rule about funding allocation. So to me, like, we started to kind of suss things out, and now we lost what we did before, and we're not dividing it into any kind of categories that make sense to me, where I can comment in some kind of an intelligent way.
Andy. If we could have the microphone go to Andy, please.
Thank you. I would like for you, just for my benefit, under local jobs, creation equity, if you could put performance measures for competitively funded programs under that too. I know that that's probably more appropriate to talk to when we get to that specific point, but I'm going to forget. So if you would make a note of that, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. All right, I'm going to suggest that we wrap this discussion up. We've got a lot of great ideas. Certainly, if there are others that you all want to have added, you can email us about them. We will get this list to be as complete as possible, and then we are going to, at a future meeting, try and come back and figure out into which category you want each of these things to be placed. So we will go from there. I think that we have about 20 minutes left, and I believe we do have a presentation on complete streets today, as you all requested. So I want to have that presentation, and that I think will be 10 to 15 minutes. Is that right, Megan? I don't know where Megan is. There's Megan. And then I might suggest that before we break, we ask Matthew Todd to just introduce the straw man alternative to us, and then we'll go home and people can think about those things in preparation for our next meeting. So, Megan.
Okay, I know, but I'm between you all and going home, so never the right place to be, right, in a presentation. But my presentation's mostly pictures, hopefully some great ideas, and just kind of food for thought as you think about things to factor in to what this measure turns out to be. I am a resident and employee in Contra Costa, so this is near and dear to my heart as well. So what are complete streets? They're streets for everybody, for every trip, for every mode, for every user, no matter how far they want to travel, where they want to go, and how they're going to get there. They're important for all modes, and that's not just pedestrians and bicycles and vehicles, but also trucks, also transit, and for everybody, no matter what age, no matter what their abilities, no matter what type of special circumstances they might have. I've heard the term AAA, all ages and abilities, and we're also using the phrase 8 to 80 a lot, the 8-year-old to the 80-year-old. So complete streets are ones that can serve all of these different users with all of their needs that they have. Been talking a lot about kind of the context and the policies that are already in place here in California, and that's true for sure for complete streets, starting at the federal level, as well as an act that we have in California for complete streets, deputy directive to Caltrans to make sure that they're prioritizing complete streets. Here in the Bay Area, there's a checklist for all projects that MTC funds, and then here in Contra Costa, we have also policies that are in place and existing countywide plans for pedestrians and bicycles and the circulation element as well. And I think what really matters, though, when it comes to complete streets is not just the policy context, but the implementation. And I think that's really where this measure comes into play, is what is that going to look like for going forward here in the county. So some photos to think about what complete streets look like, how we envision complete streets, and they can be corridor-wide treatments that really focus on revitalizing a downtown, making the entire street work better for all modes and all users, and also really kind of more intersection-based or spot treatments that you can think of for improving the experience for all users. Bus-only lanes. So when we think about complete streets, we really think about kind of the front of the building to the front of the building across the street, and how we reallocate that transportation infrastructure space in between. And one of those options can be thinking about providing different spaces for different modes, such as making an entire lane available for buses. And thinking about that in terms of the type of bus facilities that we might be prioritizing. So bus rapid transit would have definite infrastructure needs, not just for the lane itself, but also making sure that we had the technology to support it and the experience that you're riding a bus, but you feel like you're riding a train or riding some other kind of more enhanced type of vehicle. can also take space and reallocate it for bikes. And this is a type of treatment I think that we're going to see a lot more in the Bay Area. I've been involved in a lot of planning studies that are envisioning these, that are just now receiving funding from the state level and from the region to start to implement them. So this is a cycle track. This is really supposed to replicate that experience you have of riding on a trail to riding on the street, and to really kind of address that first mile, last mile, so that that 8-year-old to that 80-year-old can get all the way to the final destination and not just have it be for recreational purposes. Pedestrian scrambles, you probably recognize this one from downtown Walnut Creek, right across from the Cheesecake Factory. So this is ways that we can change our traffic signals so that you can cross diagonally through the intersection and have a lot more options for pedestrians to navigate through without having the conflicting movements of vehicles that are turning left and right. There's also new devices that even just a few years ago were not available to us in California that really, in particular, focus on pedestrian safety. There was an article in the Chronicle today about the device on the left, the pedestrian hybrid beacon, also known as the Hawk, going in San Jose for the first time this week. So this is a device that's now approved for us to use and is really important for improving pedestrian safety on arterials and busy streets. And the one in the bottom right is called the Rectangular Rapid Flashing Beacon, and it also is a newer device that we have approval to use in California. Oh, okay, great. So it is half a traffic signal and half a stop sign. All right, so when nobody is there, it is blank, just like a ramp meter when you're getting on the freeway. So if it's not in use, it's dark. And that means you don't need to stop, you just travel on through. But when a pedestrian gets there and presses the button, then it goes to a flashing yellow. So it indicates to everybody that the signal is getting ready to activate. And then it goes to a solid red, and it works just like a traffic light, right? So you stop, and that's why it's such an effective device, is because it's a red light. Everybody understands this is a red light, I need to stop, rather than some of these other beacons that are flashing yellow, and maybe people yield, but sometimes they don't. But what makes it really efficient in terms of the benefit for the vehicles on the road is then it goes into an alternating, it's called a wigwag. So it flashes left, right with the red. When it goes into that phase, you can stop and then proceed, which means if the pedestrian has already passed on their way, you can continue on rather than having to stop through the whole length of the traffic signal you'd have to with a regular signal. And then it goes back to blank. So it gets more efficiency for the vehicles that are using the road, but more protection, more safety for the pedestrians. So a great new device that's available to us. Complete interchanges. I think this is one of the, as we think about the next generation of pedestrian and bicycle planning and really connecting our neighborhoods, you can kind of fix the east side of town and fix the west side of town in terms of giving people options, but often it's those interchanges right in the middle that means that you can't really make those cross-town trips and really knit your neighborhoods together. And so there's lots of options, and I've been involved in working on some national guidelines to retrofit interchanges, especially the ramps, to slow things down and make it such that pedestrians and bicyclists can actually go through the interchanges. And this is an example of a project that we just found out last week got funding from the county for active transportation plans here from the region. Here, this is here in Contra Costa County. Rumrell Boulevard, it's on the kind of edge of Richmond and of San Pablo. And this is just a simulation to show you what the result of a kind of really in-depth community planning session to re-envision this roadway was to make it a truly complete street. It has about 5 different segments, but we broke it into the 2 kind of most distinct segments. This is the section of the corridor that's south of Market. Right now, this is a picture of the existing condition. It has 2 lanes of traffic in each direction, no bicycle facilities, pretty poor pedestrian facilities. It does have a bus route on it, but the reliability of the bus route is pretty limited. And this is the proposed treatment that just got $4.3 million in funding allocated to it. Truly a complete street that provides for all users and really is going to become the main street of this community, major connector between Contra Costa College and the Richmond BART station. So some key elements of that, reconstructing the sidewalk so that when you go through the driveways, you don't have to do this all the way down the corridor. Putting in new street trees and landscape buffers so that the pedestrians walking through the corridor have some buffer and some space between them and the cars. Putting in one of those cycle tracks. So what I mentioned, I think we're going to start to see a lot more of these, and this is certainly going to be one of the first ones that we see here in Contra Costa if it goes forward to final design. And what really is the hallmark of this is there's a protection. There's the bicycle lane, but there's either going to be the parked cars or a planter strip or both, so that you feel like you're more on a trail rather than in the street itself. And in order to allocate that space, it went from 2 lanes in each direction to 1 lane in each direction. So it's a road diet, a repurpose of the space, and we did a lot of traffic analysis, a lot of working with the community, especially the business owners, to have that be their preferred solution to make this more of a complete street. Public transit, this particular segment of it does not have a bus stop, but we did enhance public transit by putting, right now there's no shelters, no benches, no information, no wayfinding at all, so that's true in all of it. We made sure that we had enough width for the buses to get through, and we worked collaboratively with AC Transit on the design for all of it. Go ahead.
In some streets, in some scenarios, they would convert that planter that you see there into what would be a bus shelter or a bus stop, so the bus could just stop at an intersection where those are and just load and unload people. That would, yeah, they might have to cross through a bike lane, but they're doing that already in San Francisco.
That's right, and that was one of the options that we looked at, and there were some ADA concerns about crossing pedestrians through the bike lane over to what would have been a bus bulb in that case, but that is certainly something on a corridor-by-corridor basis. It means that the buses would stop in lane rather than pulling over. This is the northern section of the corridor. Right now, 2 lanes in each direction. What makes this different from the southern section is there's no on-street parking, and there's also this raised median. It's about 4 feet wide with hardscape. And this is the after condition with what's proposed in the preferred design. You see here that we've got a bioswale for stormwater management, and that also creates a much better buffer for the pedestrian that's walking along this road. And the major difference here is it still is a protected bike lane, but it's protected by kind of a raised rubber curb here instead of something that's more of a hardscape. And the reason for that is to accommodate emergency vehicles. We have a raised median here, and we need to have at least 20 feet of clearance so that ambulances, fire trucks can pass. So it was trying to do all that while still value engineering and not touching the median, which would have been a much more expensive proposition. This example of just another road diet. The road diets are, of course, not the only way to make complete streets. I don't want that to be a takeaway, but certainly one of the common and high cost-benefit ways often that cities are doing this. This is an example in Fresno that was just done by repainting. So they don't always have to be a really high-budget investment either. Road diets and other types of repurposing of corridors are one way that we can take a street and make them work for all modes and all users, but sometimes it needs to be more thinking about it from a network perspective. So carving up networks into priority, this is my priority bike area, my priority pedestrian area, my priority transit area is another way that cities are often approaching this. Alameda has this for their entire city, and Oakland's working on it for downtown as well. And that really helps to prescribe how those trade-off decisions can be made when the time comes to decide how do we want to repurpose the transportation infrastructure here, and kind of which mode is going to be the priority mode for this corridor. So when you make that decision as a network, then you're not having to recreate the wheel every time a new project opportunity comes up. It's really clear this is where the bicyclist should get a really heavy investment. This is where transit is really the high priority. And there's all kinds of scorecards and methodologies that can be used. We did this for Rumrill. We worked with the community to develop what their performance measures were going to be for each of the different modes and use these scorecards to really help us in a really objective, transparent way decide how we were going to select the bicycle, the transit, the pedestrian, and the auto opportunities for the corridor. A lot of this has to do with engineering, but there's complementary processes and programs that can be in place and some things to think about in terms of kind of what the measure might include beyond just the engineering aspects itself. Certainly land use planning, thinking about opportunities for mixed use and to make it such that people have destinations to walk and bike to. The incentives for transit and the transportation demand management. I know shuttles are a big topic right now, and thinking about shuttles' roles in complete streets, as well as technology. We've talked about electric vehicles. Certainly autonomous vehicles are a part of this discussion too, and what does that mean as we think about dedicated lanes for autonomous vehicles at some point and other types of technologies. And then, of course, there's the co-benefits, and sometimes this means the co-funding opportunities, right? So there's especially for active transportation, public health reasons, to be prioritizing, providing more opportunities for walking and biking. And that often means that we have public health stakeholders that come to the table and public health funding. And then economic development and economic benefits of providing more options for more modes and more users can be a real reason to invest. And certainly there are a lot of studies that show that complete streets do have these type of measurable benefits for communities. So that's it for my short presentation, hopefully a lot of pictures and ideas, and I'd really be happy to answer any questions that you all have on kind of the fundamentals of complete streets.
Yeah, I have a question that might be for Ross or Dave or someone on staff at the EPAC who's been thinking more about this than I have. So this was a very helpful presentation for me. I think I now know a lot more about what people mean when they talk about complete streets. And I can envision how a competitive program to fund complete streets projects would work in the expenditure plan. But it's a little harder for me to envision how it would work to have a complete streets requirement attached to something else, as I think is shown in the straw man expenditure plan and has been discussed in other contexts, that if you want to get funded for a street project, it's got to incorporate complete streets, or repaving projects have to incorporate complete streets. Knowing how broad this concept is, if the project proponent's intention is to do something other than complete streets, and CCTA's intention is, well, if you're going to do that, you got to do complete streets, how do you figure out what that means?
Yeah, well, I think that's the purpose of the discussion here, and then I'll jump in and let others discuss it as well. So a number of the projects that were proposed as we reached out to our stakeholders were labeled as complete streets, and I think part of the discussion that some folks wanted to have here is that be more than just a label, that there be some explicit requirements to get that designation. So it could be, part of a competitive program that just have a bucket of money to be complete streets. It could be specific projects that would be named and be named as complete streets. That we'd have some real requirements to make sure that we're not doing a resurfacing job and calling it a complete streets. So I don't know if that helps with your questions, but at least that's what it was in my mind, is to look at those two things, and there may be others.
I know Seth had a question. Dave, do you want to respond to that further, or
I can wait.
I was actually just kind of curious. This is a lot like increased technology, in that you can spend a whole bunch of money on this, and you have to prioritize you have to set priorities just like anything. But are there any kind of basic metrics for any standards for complete streets costs, or is it just project by project? And you start with an overall plan for a specific location, or can you do a complete streets plan for an entire city?
Both, for sure. And the layered network that I was mentioning actually needs to be done neighborhood, if not citywide. So if you went from more of a policy, how are we going to make the trade-offs decision, it needs to be done at that perspective. In terms of cost, there's a couple ways that we've been doing that. One is looking citywide. There's some good kind of rules of thumb for traffic volume levels on roads that if they're below that, road diets are really easy, and you can do them just with paint. And so that could be one effort, would just be to say, okay, we want to look at all the 4-lane roads in the county that have less than 15,000 vehicles on them per day, and next time they come up for paving, let's just restripe them with bike lanes. And that's almost a no-cost solution, because you're going to be repaving and restriping them anyway. And then there's also interim design that we've been doing a lot of, and that's to use kind of lower-cost materials. It helps you do a couple of things. Helps you get community support around it. If people are not sure about the idea, you get to actually experience it. And then it also helps you with the engineering process, because maybe there's different aspects of the design that you weren't quite sure how you wanted to do it, and you can move the materials around a little bit and kind of modify the design before you spend a lot of money. And those types of projects compete really well for competitive funding, because you've shown how much community support you had to get for it, and then also that you're more confident in your design. And Telegraph Avenue, which just got the #1 allocation for the region, did do that interim design for Bike to Work Day as a way of kind of showing both of those.
Dave Campbell.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Really appreciate it. I would answer, I think, Mike's good question, and even Seth's related question. To me, it boils down to cost. And if like Megan says, you can restripe or repave a street, and you can do a bike lane or a pedestrian improvement or any other complete element to it beyond the repaving without additional cost, the current complete street policies we have function pretty well to encourage cities to do that. It's when there's an additional cost they fail. And that's why Bike East Bay is pushing for a complete streets program that provides the additional funding, or actually provides the funding, to proactively enter into a project that builds in these incomplete elements back into the streets that we use every day. And that's why it's so important to us, because, yes, cities support complete streets. It's just they're tied budget-wise. And so we're not there yet. The straw man that we will be talking about soon doesn't have complete streets in it, but I want to push that it has a dedicated complete streets program that has the funding in it. It can, the whole overall plan can have a complete streets policy. That's great. Just know that when it gets down to project by project basis, it comes down to the cost. That's why I think we need a dedicated program.
I see Pat, and then we do have one speaker from the public on this, Kenji Yamada. So why don't we take Pat, and then we'll take public comment.
Yeah, just briefly, if Complete Streets is implemented to truly try to serve all kinds of users who are people rather than just modes, then one of the advantages that's kind of convoluted, but what it can do is, with regard to ADA paratransit, it can make it easier as costs and baby boomers numbers start increasing. Complete Streets makes it easier for people who would otherwise have difficulty getting to and from a bus stop to actually use the bus. And in that way, they can use fixed route bus rather than paratransit at 10 times the cost. So it can create some savings for the community. What's happening more recently is, with some of the move towards protecting bike lanes, if that's not thought through properly, it creates barriers for the paratransit vehicle that's trying to get the user from the vehicle to the curb across these other protected spaces. And so it all needs to work together. San Francisco and Seattle are becoming the models for making that work. There's pedestrians and pedestrians, and a wheelchair user doesn't walk the same way a walker does. So it all needs to be looked at as pieced together.
All right, let's take public comment on this item. Kenji Yamada.
Hello, Mr. Early, members of staff, and members of the committee. My name is Kenji Yamada. I'm an alternate for Dave Campbell of Bike East Bay. I'm also an organizer of Bike Concord. We are a local residents bike advocacy organization. We're working to make bicycle transportation a safe, convenient option in Concord and also in Central Contra Costa more broadly. This is a goal I believe is shared by CCTA and also by many members of this committee. In seeking this goal, we've encountered two principal obstacles over a couple of years of engagement with both the city and the county. The first of those obstacles is the prioritization of motor traffic flow, which is known to traffic engineers as level of service, over safety for bicycle traffic, and also over safety for pedestrian traffic to some extent. If bicycling is to become a significant component of our county's transportation, it must both be and feel safe to non-expert cyclists. And it must follow routes that are at least as direct as those used by motor traffic. In most cases, this means protected bike lanes or cycle tracks on streets. Trails are great. We have some good ones in this area, but they don't reach all the destinations that people need to get to, workplaces and shopping and so on. So streets are necessary. Trails are not a substitute for them. The need for safe bicycle infrastructure is most acute in places where there's the most motor traffic. I think there's a tendency sometimes to go with a low-hanging fruit approach to add infrastructure in the places where it's easiest, where it's cheapest, where it requires the least disturbance to motor traffic. These are the places where it's least needed. Sometimes the conflict between keeping cars flowing and safety for those who are not in cars can't be avoided. That conflict has to be met head-on. And I'd like to recommend to you the priority of safety over motor traffic flow in cases where that conflict is unavoidable. Sometimes it can be mitigated, sometimes it can't. If significant bicycle mode share is a goal for CCTA in this committee, then this transportation expenditure plan must set policies accordingly. Putting in bicycle infrastructure in places where it's most needed on roads with heavy motor traffic takes a lot of money. These redesigns have multiple phases that are all expensive. And if that money doesn't come from the county, and if it doesn't come from this new sales tax, it will be very hard to find. We've run into situations in Concord where we were told, basically, if this is going to happen, you're going to have to get money from the county. Well, where will that money come from? It'll come from the plan that you put together in this room, or it won't come from anywhere. So the funding is the second obstacle. Finally, I'd like to bring up a more concrete safety need for bicycle traffic, which was touched on by Megan, and that is safety crossing freeway ramps. There's a lot of places in this county where you have to bicycle under a freeway to get somewhere. It's extremely dangerous at all of them. These freeways serve as walls to prevent you from going from one side of the county to the other. The technical problem has mostly been solved. There are treatments that are well considered. Megan and her colleague Matthew presented some of them at a meeting a few months ago of the Caltrans District 4 Bicycle Advisory Committee. So these treatments are available. The obstacle is political will and it's money. And it's the second of those obstacles that you in this room are in a position to solve. I've run into, when trying to track down responsibility to solve this problem, I've run into some ambiguity about who is responsible to start the projects to seek the funding. The conclusion I've come to is that it's the county. And right now, as far as allocating the money for the county to do that, that falls to you. Caltrans has to be involved, of course, because it involves freeways. Cities have to be involved. But I was told actually by a Caltrans staff member, Ina Gerhard, that the county is in the position to do this, to start the projects, because the county is the locus of funding. That pretty much wraps up my comment. Thank you for the hours you've devoted to this process. I know it's long and arduous, and there are many concerns you have to balance, so I appreciate very much your time. Thank you.
Any other public comments on item 2? Okay. Any further questions or comments from EPAC members for Megan? All right. Well, seeing none, it's 4:10. I had said maybe we'd have a brief introduction of the straw man alternative, but I think we've gone long enough that probably we need to get going. Thank you all for your time. We will reconvene again in 2 weeks and go on from there. Thank you.